A sacred book, its pages missing. Was it faith or a crime concealed? Welcome to Veil Files. I am your host, Thorn. Tell me in the comments where you're joining from today. Your voices turn mysteries into shared journeys. Let's begin. It was on a bleak morning in late November when I first heard of the affair of the torn Bible. London lay beneath a heavy curtain of fog that pressed close to the windows of Baker Street, muffling the sounds of passing cabs and shrouding the lamps in halos of dim light. Holmes, wrapped in his dressing gown, sat cross-legged upon the hearth rug with a violin across his knees, plucking at the strings in absent-minded discord. His hawk-like features were as sharp as ever, but there was a restlessness about him that betrayed the hunger of a mind too long denied its proper nourishment. "For a week, Watson," said he, breaking off a harsh chord, "we have been reduced to trifles, lost umbrellas, a tradesman's quarrel, and Mrs. Hudson's missing teacup. I am starving." He struck the violin with sudden ferocity. "What is the worth of a mind tuned to the finest edge of analysis if it must content itself with such paltry diversions?" I was about to offer a soothing reply when a knock came at the door. A moment later, Inspector Lestrade entered, his coat damp with fog and his expression unusually grave. He carried beneath his arm a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "You've asked for something meatier, Mr. Holmes," he said without preamble. "I think I've found it. A most peculiar crime has taken place in Hampstead. Not theft exactly, nor violence in the ordinary sense. But I confess I am at a loss." Holmes's languor vanished at once. He rose to his feet with the alacrity of a bloodhound scenting prey. "Out with it, Lestrade! What have you there?" The inspector laid the parcel upon the table and unfolded its wrappings. Within lay a large family Bible, its binding scuffed, its gilt edges dulled with age. Yet the damage that arrested our attention was not natural wear. Whole leaves had been torn savagely from the volume, leaving ragged stubs of paper along the spine. "Pages gone?" Holmes asked, his fingers already turning over the ruined leaves. "Indeed." "And in a house where murder has just been committed." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Ah, now you interest me," Lestrade explained in clipped sentences. "A wealthy widower, Mr. Ezra Pilkington had been found dead in his Hampstead study the previous night, his skull fractured by a blunt instrument. The room showed no sign of robbery save for the Bible upon his desk, mutilated in this strange fashion. The servants swore that it had been whole the evening before. "It is the oddest detail of all," said Lestrade, rubbing his thin hands. "Nothing else appears missing. No plate, no money. Just these leaves torn clean away. Scotland Yard thinks it the act of a madman." I am not so sure Holmes, meanwhile, had carried the book to the window. He tilted it to the light, examining the binding with his magnifying glass. "Curious? Very curious," he murmured. His long fingers traced the jagged stubs. "See here, Watson. The leaves were not all taken from the same portion. One torn from Genesis, another from Psalms, and several from the Gospels. A strange pattern, is it not?" "Pattern?" I repeated. To my untrained eye, it was mere vandalism. Holmes snapped the book shut. "No, my dear fellow, no. Vandalism is random, this is deliberate, and where there is deliberation there is motive. Lestrade, you were right to come." The inspector gave a short laugh of relief. "Then you'll take the case, Mr. Holmes?" "Take it?" Holmes's grey eyes gleamed with sudden fire. "Why, man, it has already taken me. Watson, fetch your coat. We go to Hampstead at once." And thus began the case of the Bible with pages torn away. Lestrade had secured a hansom, and within the quarter hour we were rattling northward through the damp pall that lay over London. Holmes leaned forward with his long fingers steepled, the mutilated Bible in his lap. From time to time he ran a thumb lightly along the raw spine where the missing leaves had been torn, as a musician might test the frets of an unfamiliar instrument. I could tell from the glitter in his eye that some suggestion had already flared in that keen mind of his, but, true to his habitual method, he kept his counsel until facts could be made to answer to theory. Pilkington House stood in a sober terrace near the heath, substantial with a discreet display of wealth, in its clean steps, polished knocker, and the faint glow of silk curtains behind the panes. We were shown in by a butler of the old school, a gaunt fellow named Jarvis, who announced us without surprise. Lestrade's influence had clearly preceded him. The household trod softly, as if sound itself might disturb the solemnity that descends upon a home where death has called. "In here, gentlemen," said Lestrade, leading us to a walnut door at the back of the hall. "The study. We've left it as we found it." The chamber we entered bore the stamp of a man who lived among papers and respectability. Books lined the walls in dark ranks, a great escritoire occupied the window nook, a Turkish carpet swallowed sound. The odour was of bindings, stale tobacco, and the faintest trace of coal gas from the fire, which had burned low to a ruddy core. Upon that same carpet, a pace or two from the corner of the desk, lay the late Ezra Pilkington, his grey head turned slightly to one side, his hands half closed, as if they had clutched at the air. A livid bruise marred the right temple, and a darker star of blood had soaked into the hair. "The doctor says the skull was fractured by a single blow," Lestrade remarked in a subdued tone. "Heavy instrument, no sharp edge, poker or club. There's the hearth poker, too clean for my liking." He nodded toward the grate, where a brass poker lay upon its stand, shining obscenely in the firelight. Holmes knelt with that peculiar feline grace of his and brought his glass to bear upon the dead man's sleeve, the carpet pile, the faint arc of spattered soot upon the fender. He neither spoke nor allowed his eye to linger overlong upon the face. The features of the departed have seldom yielded him more than their habits. "Rigour beginning," he murmured at last. "Death not more than 6 hours gone when discovered?" 5.5 by the surgeon's reckoning," Lestrade returned. "Found at 11:15 by the daughter. Ah, there is a daughter. And a son-in-law. Mrs. Clara Whitby and Mr. Matthew Whitby. Also a secretary, Owenvale, though he did not sleep in. 2 maids, a housemaid, and Jarvis here. The widow, as you heard, long deceased." Holmes neither nodded nor questioned further. He had shifted to the desk. There, in the place of honour a devout man would accord to Scripture, lay the Bible we had examined in Baker Street. Beside it, a churchwarden pipe, unlit, a small dish of Turkish cigarettes, a paper knife of bone, a blotting book with its flap open, and a square of black sealing wax with a nick fresh enough to retain a tiny crescent of dust. "You say the servants swore the Bible had been whole the evening before," he said. Jarvis, who had been a cairn of propriety in the doorway, inclined his head. "Mr. C. Pilkington read from it nightly after supper, sir. It was entire at 9 o'clock. Mrs. Whitby would tell you the same." Holmes lifted the volume and tilted it as he had done before, examining not merely the torn margins but the edges of the remaining leaves. "You see, Watson," he said, indicating with a finger the faintest shadow of graphite along one ragged stump. "A pencil has been at work upon these leaves at some time, underlined passages perhaps, or marginalia, lately enough that the smear is yet to the touch. Do you observe how the graphite ceases precisely where the tear begins? We have lost more than paper." Lestrade gave a sceptical grunt. "Underlined verses, Mr. Holmes?" "Many a gentleman marks his Bible, indeed, but few remove the leaves wholesale to preserve their privacy," Holmes rejoined softly. "Let us learn what we can from what remains." He turned to the grate with a swift motion, took the tongs, and teased out from between the ash a little curl of burnt paper no larger than a postage stamp. He laid it upon the blotter, moistened a finger, and gently unfurled it. It was hopelessly charred at the edges, yet in the centre a few printed characters could be made out. "Why, the genealogies," Holmes said. "But which?" He glanced at the spine stubs again. "Genesis would serve for Begat, but so would Matthew. We shall not decide upon so little." He cast about the hearth once more and retrieved a second fragment. This one bore no letters, but a faint ruled line and the ghost of a number, as if from a page head. He smiled without mirth. Our vandal made haste, and afterwards repented of the litter. There is not enough here to reconstruct his conscience. His, I ventured. His, hers, or theirs, Holmes said. We must be Catholic in our pronouns until facts grow sex. Lestrade, who had gone to the window and back again, like an anxious crow, said, The window was found bolted on the inside. The door locked, key still within. We had to force it. That looks to me like our man was inside at the time of the blow, and left by the door before it was discovered. Holmes rose, crossed to the window, and made a minute inspection of the catch, the sill, and the lower sash. He produced from his pocket a thin blade of steel and slid it, with the gentlest pressure, beneath the catch. The sash lifted the merest fraction. A trivial latch, he remarked. A schoolboy with a penknife could persuade it. Note, however, the varnish, unbroken, save here. He touched a hairline scratch no longer than a grain of rice. This is as fresh as the nick upon the sealing wax. And here, between the inner beading and the pane, a smear of something translucent. He scraped delicately and held up the residue. Gutta percha, softened and used to steady a blade, I fancy. No burglar of the rougher sort wastes such nicety. Yet the dust upon the outer sill is undisturbed, so if the window served, it was for show. He moved now in widening circles, as a hound quarters a field. First the fender, then the chair, pushed back from the desk. Its casters had left a telltale crescent in the pile, then the carpet where the dead man lay. He paused near the hearthrug's border and crouched. Ah. What is it, Holmes? I asked. He did not immediately answer. From his pocket he took a little envelope and, with a penknife, flicked into it a few grains of some pale substance gathered from the fringe of the rug. He then examined the heel of Pilkington's right shoe and nodded once, as if at a private point scored. Grit, he said at last, but not London grit. Fine, pale, with a faint sparkle, micaceous. There is none upon the streets in this quarter tonight. You may be satisfied of that, Watson, by the state of our own boots. Yet see, too, the toe of the shoe. There, and on the carpet beyond, is a darker smear, mud mixed with coal dust. Two soils upon the same floor within an hour of each other. Either our poor gentleman walked in places he had not visited for many a week, or else more than one pair of soles trod this rug tonight. Lestrade's lips thinned. We've a name, if that's what you require for your theory. Josiah Pike, former clerk. Turned out for dishonesty 3 months back. He's been seen lurking near the house in recent weeks. They say he comes from the brickfields beyond Highgate. Plenty of grit there. Holmes was already at the escritoire. He sniffed the dish of cigarettes, took one, and broke it cleanly in two. Turkish, heavy on the Latakia. Do you smoke them, Jarvis? No, sir. Mr. Pilkington took a churchwarden after supper, if at all. The Turkish, those are Mr. Vale's, I believe. The secretary and Mr. Whitby? Cigars, sir. Mild Virginia or leaf. Holmes bent over the ashtray and separated a heap with the tip of his knife. Here, then, is a cigar ash, dark flake, short, Virginia, but there beneath a pinch of fine grey ash that has fallen in a perfect cone. Turkish. 2 smokers at the desk after supper, perhaps, and the owner of the pipe absent. Add to that the smell which still lingers, bay rum of the barbers, foreign to this room, which Watson ordinarily breathes Russian leather and dust. Our visitors did not linger long, yet they left their signatures. Visitors? Lestrade broke in. We know of one. Mr. Whitby was with his father-in-law at 10 o'clock. He says they argued. Pilkington dismissed him. Whitby left. The daughter found the body at 11:15. Arguments, Holmes said, are an orchard in which policemen harvest alibis. He closed the blotting book, then opened it again, and smiled in that thin, unpleasant way of his when an adversary underestimates him. Observe, the blotter carries the reverse of what was last written. Can you make it out, Watson? I peered. The mirror script defeated me, though I descried a capital letter P and a short word that might have been sun. Holmes produced a tiny hand glass from his pocket and adjusted the angle. Codicil to be read? Not to Whitby. And here, a name that tails off. O.V. He let the flap fall. Owen Vale, I make it, though I will not swear to the last letter on this imperfect evidence. Lestrade stared. A codicil? But the solicitor's among the callers, and he has said nothing of, then let us not teach him his business before we have heard it, Holmes answered. You have the family in the morning room. They are waiting, said Lestrade. Shall I? In a moment. One more matter. Holmes returned to the body and touched the right cuff with his glass. Ink upon the thumb and first finger, but none upon the left arm, mister. Pilkington wrote something after supper and before death, wrote hastily too, for he has smudged the side of his hand. Yet the paper knife shows no trace of ink, and the pen rests dry. The last page of the blotter is newly torn out. Where is that sheet? Jarvis, was anything burned in the fire tonight beyond what Mr. Pilkington ordinarily consumed? The butler's brow creased. After supper, sir, I did note he rang for me to add coals. When I entered, he was at his desk with the Bible open. There was paper in the grate then, sir, a strip or two, curling. He bade me close the door when I left, and you saw no one enter thereafter? No, sir. But the study door is fitted with a spring. It closes of itself. Mr. Whitby was in the drawing-room with Mrs. Whitby at 9, I am sure. Later he came down. Holmes's gaze drifted to the window again, and then to the mantel, where 3 pressed violets lay in a small frame under glass, tokens of some feminine sentiment that had survived the man's hard years. Beneath the frame, a smear scarcely visible, like the touch of a dirty glove upon marble. He ran a fingertip over it and smelled it. Coal dust, he said, almost to himself. Pike, Lestrade repeated, as if the name were a cudgel with which he might beat the room into agreement. Perhaps, Holmes allowed. But Pike does not wear bay rum, nor does a dismissed clerk bring gutta percha to coax a sash, nor smoke the better class of Turkish cigarette, nor argue of codicils with a merchant prince. Let us meet your orchard of alibis, Inspector. I have a fancy that one of the trees bears a bruise upon its bark. We left the study then, Jarvis closing the door upon the poor inert shape within. As we moved down the passage, Holmes paused suddenly and stooped, as if to tie a lace. In fact, he lifted from the runner a tiniest droplet of candle grease, pale, almost invisible, and deposited it with satisfaction into the same little envelope that held the grit. He straightened without comment, but the expression that touched his ascetic features told me he had added yet another weight to the scale he was so delicately balancing. In the morning room we found Mrs. Clara Whitby, a handsome woman whose grief fought with indignation in the tremor of her mouth, her husband, a robust fellow with a florid complexion and a nervous habit of striking his fist into his palm, and Mr. Owen Vale, slender, smooth-cheeked, the very pattern of a modern clerk, with his immaculate cuffs and attentive eye. A gentleman of legal cut, the family solicitor, Mr. Carberry stood apart, gazing into the fire as if it might absolve him from his share in these proceedings. They rose as we entered. Holmes's courtesy was of the driest. He bowed to the lady, and then to Lestrade. If you please, Inspector, a word from each, and in this order, Mr. Whitby, Mr. Vale, Mr. Carberry, and last Mrs. Whitby. We will have the Times in their proper places with no embroidery. Times? Mr. Whitby blustered. I have told the Inspector, sir. I left this house at 10:10 by the clock in the hall. We shall put a pin in 10:10, Holmes said evenly, and we shall ask the clock whether it is susceptible to flattery. Pray be seated. As they resumed their chairs, the door clicked gently behind us. Holmes's eye travelled from face to face, as if he were committing a gallery of actors to memory before the first line was spoken. When he turned to the window, it was not to admire the fog, but to mark, as I later learned, the faintest smear upon the inner sash where a gloved thumb had pressed. He did not yet speak of it. Instead, he drew his notebook and, with the most neutral voice in the world, said, "Begin, if you please." Thus, with the house hushed and the fog crowding the panes, the inquiry opened. And though I then believed we were about to tread the familiar dance of jealousies and inheritances, I confess that certain details, the vanished leaves, the codicil hinted at in the blotter, the alien scent in the sanctum, and the twin soils upon the rug, had already pricked me with the uneasy sense that we were being invited by some unseen hand to walk a path laid out with too much care. Holmes, for his part, looked as a man looks when he has heard, far off in the mist, the first note of a tune he knows will end in a flourish. Mr. Matthew Whitby was the first to speak, and he did so with the impatience of a man who believes the matter already settled in his favour. His florid face glowed in the firelight, and he tugged at his watch-chain as though to draw authority from its weight. "I have nothing to conceal, gentlemen," he declared. "I was with my father-in-law in the study shortly after supper. He had been in ill humour for weeks, his business failing, his temper growing daily more uncertain. He spoke in bitter terms of his will, of certain bequests he now regretted, and in particular he railed against myself. Harsh words passed between us, and I quitted the room. The hall clock read 10 minutes past 10. My wife will confirm that I left the house almost immediately. Thereafter Mrs. Whitby inclined her head, though her lips pressed tight, as if the words cost her dear. Holmes made a brief note without looking up. "You did not return?" "Certainly not." "And the distance to your own residence?" 7 minutes' walk, no more." "Then by 10:20 you were home?" "I was." Holmes's grey eyes, cool and penetrating, fixed upon the man. "You own a pair of boots with nails set in a half-circle round the heel?" Whitby flushed scarlet. "I dare say I do." "What of it?" "Merely that we shall have them presently with any trace they carry," Holmes replied with such serenity that Whitby's bluster collapsed into a muttered oath. Holmes turned the page in his notebook and directed his gaze to the secretary. Owen Vale rose at once, smooth and self-possessed, though the faint twitch of his eyelid betrayed unease. His attire was faultless, his voice had the cultivated precision of a man who measures words as carefully as figures. "I had letters to complete for Mr. Pilkington," he said. "I remained in the office until 9, then brought the papers here for signature. Mr. Pilkington received me in the study. He appeared distracted, preoccupied with some matter upon his desk. He signed, dismissed me curtly, and I left at 9:30. I went directly to my lodgings in Bloomsbury. The landlady saw me enter before 10. Holmes asked quietly, "Do you smoke Turkish cigarettes, Mr. Vale?" "I do. Were you smoking last night?" "Not in Mr. Pilkington's presence." He disliked the odour. Holmes's pencil moved in silence. "And yet the ash lies upon his desk," he murmured. "Pray continue, Mr. Vale. Did you observe aught unusual upon the table, besides the papers you bore?" Vale hesitated. The family Bible was open before him, but that was his custom. "Nothing else? No document upon which he was writing?" "Not to my recollection." Holmes gave the barest shrug, as if to say the matter was of no consequence, though I could tell he had stored the hesitation as a jeweller notes a flaw in a gem. The solicitor, Mr. Carberry, was next. He stood with the air of a man offended by circumstance, as if murder were a breach of etiquette. "I was summoned yesterday afternoon," he said, "to advise Mr. Pilkington upon a codicil to his will. He expressed dissatisfaction with his son-in-law and spoke of diverting certain bequests to his secretary, Mr. Vale, whom he trusted. I drew the draft, and he intended to execute it formally today. Beyond that, I can add little." I took my leave before supper and returned directly to chambers. "Did you mention this codicil to anyone?" Holmes asked. "Certainly not." "Professional confidence, Mr. Holmes. It would have been a gross impropriety." Holmes tapped his chin with the pencil. "Yet the word codicil finds its ghost upon the blotting pad. Mr. Pilkington then wrote of it privately last night, perhaps intending a note to you, perhaps otherwise. Curious that a matter meant for secrecy should leave such a public trace." Carberry bridled, but said nothing further. At last, Mrs. Clara Whitby. She was pale, her eyes rimmed with red, though her back remained proud. Her voice trembled, yet there was a firmness beneath it that belied fragility. I dined with my father and husband. Afterwards, I played the piano until 10. At that hour, my husband went to speak with my father. I followed shortly, intending to smooth matters between them, but met Matthew already leaving the study. I asked if reconciliation had been achieved. He replied that it had not, and that my father was beyond persuasion. I lingered with my husband in the drawing room. At 11:15, anxious at the unusual silence, I went to the study. I found the door locked. When there was no answer to my calls, I summoned Jarvis. We forced it together and... Her voice faltered. You know what we discovered. Holmes closed his notebook with a snap. Thank you, madam. That is a faithful sequence of events. Permit me one more question. Did your father have enemies? None that I knew. He was stern, yes, but just. Only Mr. Pike, the former clerk, had cause to resent him. The name, spoken with distaste, seemed to settle like dust over the gathering. Lestrade seized upon it with obvious eagerness. There, Pike again, a dismissed servant, bitter grudge, and the grit from the brickfields to... Prove it. Holmes rose, his figure tall and austere against the lamplight. And yet, Inspector, no dismissed clerk writes codicils, smokes Turkish cigarettes, nor leaves the fragrance of bay rum in his wake. We shall not be content with the simplest scapegoat. He moved towards the door, beckoning me to follow. Come, Watson. I should like a word with Jarvis in the hall. There we found the butler awaiting our exit. Holmes addressed him in a low tone. You told us Mr. Pilkington bade you add coals at 9:30. Did you notice a candle burning upon his desk? Yes, sir. A tall one, in the silver stick. But when we forced the door, it was extinguished. Holmes nodded. And the paper you saw curling in the grate, could you distinguish its form? Jarvis thought a moment. A large sheet, sir, folded twice. Heavy paper, such as the solicitor brings. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Precisely. When we rejoined Lestrade, the inspector was already issuing orders to have Pike apprehended. Holmes did not interfere, though I saw the faint curve of amusement upon his lips. He merely requested that Whitby's boots be produced, and, when they arrived, he examined the heels with his glass. You will note, Watson, the half-circle of nails. A common enough pattern, but distinct from the smooth-soled slippers, mister. Pilkington wears indoors. Observe also this edge, freshly scraped, as if upon stone. I think we shall find that grit upon the rug has its echo here. Whitby protested furiously, but Holmes waved him silent. No conclusions yet, sir. Only observations. At length, having gathered his samples and observations, Holmes declared that we must depart for Baker Street. There are matters which require the instruments of my own cabinet. Inspector, I commend Pike to your vigilance. By all means detain him, but do not stake the gallows upon him. He is too obvious. We returned through the fog, and once at Baker Street, Holmes set about his experiments with the eager precision of a chemist. He laid the pale grit upon a slide, applied a drop of solution, and examined it under his lens. As I thought, micaceous sandstone, peculiar to the brickfields of Highgate. Our Mr. Pike cannot be dismissed, yet see this darker smear I gathered with it, the coal dust. That is not from Highgate, that is from the very cellars beneath Pilkington House. 2 visitors, Watson, not one. He turned next to the droplet of candle grease. This, tinted faintly blue. Such candles are sold only by Dobson's in Holborn for ceremonial use. I shall make inquiries. And lastly, this trace of bay rum, I fancy we shall connect it not to Pike, but to some gentleman nearer the hearth of that household. I watched him in silence, marvelling as always at the delicate certainty of his deductions. At last I ventured, Do you incline towards Whitby, Holmes? He gave a thin smile. Whitby is hot-tempered and foolish, but folly alone does not orchestrate such deliberate theft as the mutilation of a Bible. No, Watson, this crime is written in the hand of calculation, The missing leaves conceal something that links Scripture with inheritance. Until we know what verses were torn away, we stumble in the dark." He lit his pipe and drew upon it deeply. "Tomorrow we shall return to Hampstead. There are questions yet unasked and a trap to be set. For the Bible, my dear fellow, holds its gospels still, though its pages lie scattered in hands we have yet to grasp." And with that, Holmes fell into one of his long silences, eyes closed, smoke curling upward, while I scribbled my notes in awe of the gathering storm. We returned to Hampstead at first light, the fog thinned to a damp gauze that clung to hedges and railings. Holmes had slept little, if at all, though he emerged from his room composed and singularly alert, with a glint in his eye that warned me he had fitted some small but essential piece into his mental mosaic. In the cab he spoke only once, and then as if continuing a conversation with himself. "The Bible, Watson? Not the piety of it, but the pagination. If one wished to hide a list, where better than among those endless begats that blanch the eye? And if one wished to point a duller observer toward a false moral, one might tear from the Gospels and Psalms as garnish, but the meat will be in the genealogies Jarvis received us with undiminished gravity." The household had slept little. There were hollow eyes and whispers in corridors. Lestrade, who had come early, met us in the hall with a face that announced triumph before he spoke. "We have pike," he said, "taken at a lodging-house near Highgate. Boots clotted with the very grit you named, mister. Holmes, and a smear of coal on the hem of his coat. He will answer hard questions." Holmes inclined his head, as one hears a weather report. "Excellent. Keep him answering, Inspector. Meanwhile, we shall continue to collect questions. I will trouble you for 5 minutes with the hall clock, and thereafter for as long in the cellar." Lestrade blinked. "The cellar? The coal dust upon the mantel is no apparition," Holmes replied. "It must have a path. Come, Watson." Before descending, he halted by the bracket that supported the great mahogany case of the hall clock. He knelt and peered within the glazed door, then took from his pocket a little paper of French chalk and dusted with patient taps the minute hand and its pivot. A faint outline bloomed where finger and nail had lately pressed. "Someone put a pin in 1010, as I suggested last night," he murmured. "Observe, Inspector, the chalk takes differently where grease lies from a recent touch. Your hour of exit may not be the hour of truth, Mr. Whitby." He turned the hands back to their present time and wiped all clean with his handkerchief. "We will not advertise that lesson yet." He led us then by a narrower door, off the servants' corridor and down a steep stair whose treads had been fretted by a century of boots. The air grew colder and denser. At the bottom lay the coal cellar, wood closet, wine bin, and the furnace room, all as neat as Jarvis's conscience could contrive. Holmes held his lantern low and advanced with the peculiar tread of a cat crossing a muddy yard, placing each footstep where dust and grit would speak the loudest. Presently he halted upon the threshold of the coal cellar. "Here," he said quietly, "an intrusion that is no part of the day's labour." He pointed to a faint trailing line upon the flagstones, coal crushed from a boot edge that had slid rather than stamped. A man unaccustomed to cellars moves with care, the porter tramps. See how the trail kisses the skirting rather than marches down the middle. He swung the lantern over the coal heap itself. The surface, smoothed by recent deliveries, showed a narrow trough, as if a knee or forearm had pressed to gain purchase. On the far side, where a ventilator opened into a low areaway beneath the study window, the lattice of iron had been loosened at one corner and eased back. Holmes touched the bolt and showed us the gleam of new scratches upon old paint. "The window above may have been theatre," he said, "but this is rehearsal and exit both. A man could crawl from the coal cellar to the area and thence to the garden path with only the fog to witness him. And if he wished to enter unseen earlier in the night, why, the way stands ready." Lestrade made a sound between doubt and grudging admiration. And our pike knows such ways. Undoubtedly, so too might any man who has ever had cause to follow a tradesman to his duties. He rapped the ventilator lightly. And now the question, did our visitor come before the blow or after? If before, he is either the hand that struck or a witness with reason to hold his tongue. If after, he came for something left behind, say a sheet torn from a blotter, or something left where it ought not to be, say a leaf from scripture that had missed the grate. He dropped to one knee without ceremony and felt along the base of the skirting with his long, sensitive fingers. Twice he shook his head, the third time his touch halted. With a penknife he prised gently and drew forth what at first I took for an insect's husk. In the lantern light it proved to be a shred of paper no larger than a postage stamp, mashed into the crack by a careless heel. Upon it, in hairline type, I could make out -- Dr. -- begat -- Holmes's nostrils flared, his nearest approach to excitement. Another begat. And look, graphite ghosting along the margin, someone had underlined. Pocket this, Watson. I will want your hand later, steady as a surgeon's when we set these fireflies in order. We retraced our way upstairs. In the study he moved as he had moved the night before, but with a swift certainty that made my heart quicken. He paused at the desk, lifted the churchwarden pipe, and replaced it precisely as it had lain. He stooped at the hearth, and, satisfied with its barren truth, turned at last to the bookcases. There, running his gaze along the spines, he stepped a pace to the right of the desk and stopped. "Jarvis," he called, "when did you last dust the upper shelves?" "Yesterday morning, sir." "Then you will forgive me if I note your zeal but not your reach." He indicated, with a forefinger no more than an inch from the cornice, a shallow smear along the topmost edge of the case, coal grey upon mahogany. "A man stood on this chair, no, not this. The impression in its cushion is too plump, on that, the ladder-backed one, and reached up with a blackened hand. For what? For that little tin. Yes, take it down, Watson." I fetched the tin. It bore a stationer's label, and once opened, disclosed sealing wafers and a stub of black wax, its square edge nicked as though recently pared. Holmes compared it to the nick on the block of sealing wax upon the desk, and smiled without mirth. Our visitor borrowed and returned with a conscience. "And now, Inspector, oblige me. Send for Mr. Vale. I will speak with him alone for 2 minutes, and with you for 1. Lestrade bristled at the arrangement, but, cowed by the assurance in Holmes's tone, consented. Vale entered with the same smooth self-command as before, but I thought it suffered a hairline crack when he saw the lantern and the dirt upon Holmes's cuff. "You were Mr. Pilkington's confidential man," Holmes began in an almost friendly voice. "You drew his letters, balanced his small accounts, locked his desk when he forgot. You knew, therefore, how he guarded what he prized, and how careless he could be when his mind ran ahead of his hand." "I did my duty, Mr. Holmes, admirably. One more duty remains. Last night you smoked a Turkish cigarette in this room, despite the late gentleman's distaste. You did so while he stood, I think, with his back to you, reading from his Bible, and you turned away to the window to exhale. When he dismissed you, you left a minute too soon, and returned by the cellar a half-hour later to correct the fault." Vale's lips thinned. "These are extravagant conjectures." "Extravagance wears a particular cologne," Holmes said gently. "Bay rum. Your barber keeps a heavy hand. Do not trouble to deny it. The scent clings where the heat of a lantern has awakened it anew. You returned because a paper remained that should not have remained, and because a paper had been burned that should not have been burned until you had copied it." For the first time, Vale's eyes moved, flicked, quite against his will, to the blotting book. Holmes saw and followed the glance as a falcon follows a rabbit's tremor. "The codicil," Holmes said. "You stood to gain by it. You stood also to be ruined by a different paper. Mr. Pilkington had found the underlinings in his Bible, names neatly marked in the genealogies, and had understood at last the private ledger you kept in sacred leaves. No? Then allow me to tell you what he understood. The names underlined in Genesis and Matthew correspond to a list of small accounts you persuaded him to extend. Charities and subscriptions, plausible and humane. Money moved, and out of each you shaved a farthing's ghost, which, multiplied, made a pound's substance, a trifling embezzlement, exquisite in its delicacy, all hidden in pious ink. But the old man at last traced the pattern and drafted a letter to Mr. Carberry. You burned the draft and came back for the ghost it had left, the impression on the blotter. Unhappily for you, impressions occur in places a man cannot predict. Vale's hands had tightened upon each other until the knuckles blanched. If I returned, he said hoarsely, it was to recover my own notes, foolish private notes, no more. It was to recover torn leaves, Holmes said, the steel now in his voice. Leaves that, bound together, make a second ledger. One is in your pocket now. The secretary's composure broke. His hand went, not to his pocket, but to the back of the chair, and he steadied himself. A heartbeat later, he mastered the spasm and smiled a little. You have an imagination, Mr. Holmes, but imagination will not hang a man. No, said Holmes with that deadly mildness I had come to dread on another's behalf. But a policeman may ask why a gentleman who swears he left at 9:30 has candle grease of a Holborn dye upon his sleeve and fine pale grit upon his shoe that is not part of his Bloomsbury pavements. He may ask why a codicil that enriches him should be burned, and why the study's window bears his thumb. He may, above all, ask why a dead man's ink lies fresh upon the right hand of the corpse while the pen is dry. The answer is that someone else wrote in his hand after his death to shift an hour here and a bequest there. That is not the work of a Brickfield clerk. Lestrade entered then, bristling with authority, and Vale, regaining his suavity as if a mask had been swiftly straightened, asked whether he were under arrest. For the present, no, Lestrade said, puzzled by the currents he felt, but could not see. You will remain at your lodgings and hold yourself at our disposal. When Vale had gone, Holmes said softly, Watch him, Inspector. Day and night. He is no murderer of the arm, but he is the brain of a scheme that has yet a missing limb. Pike will supply noise, Whitby, heat. Vale supplies. Quiet, Lestrade grunted. And the blow that killed? If not Pike, then who? Holmes's gaze drifted to the door, beyond which lay the morning room. A household is a mechanism, Inspector. Sometimes the smallest spring breaks the clock. I would speak with Mrs. Whitby again, but not of wills. Of candles. We found her in a chair by the window, a shawl about her shoulders, though the room was warm. She started when we entered, and made a visible effort to master herself. Holmes's bow was of the old school. Forgive a painful question, madam. Yesterday, did you light a candle in your father's study at any time after supper? Her eyes widened, and in the instant before she spoke, I saw that flicker, a memory she had thought insignificant, and now saw arraigned. When I went to the door at 10:30 and found it closed, the passage was dim. I took a candle from the bracket and, yes, I tried the handle and called. There was no answer. I left the candle in the sconce beside the door. Is that wrong? On the contrary, Holmes said gently, it is right and very useful. Did anyone else have occasion to take such a candle recently? A church service, perhaps? She frowned, searching. We attended St. Mark's on Sunday. The verger gave me a pair of blue-tinted altar candles for the harvest table. I brought them home by mistake. Jarvis scolded me for putting them with the household box. Are they important? They are part of a language, madam, Holmes replied, and for a moment a strange tenderness softened his features. And we are learning our letters. You have been of service? When we emerged into the corridor, he touched my sleeve. Dobson's in Holborn Supplies, Saint. Marks. The grease I lifted was of their dye. Mrs. Whitby's innocent hand placed the colour in play. Another hand carried its trace into the cellar. Veils. On this point we are secure. But for the arm that struck the heavy single blow, look not to him. His is a penman's wrist. Whitby? I asked. Whitby would swing twice, Holmes said dryly, and Pike thrice. No, there is a hand that moves between them. Come, Watson, we must pay a visit to Pike before Lestrade writes his indictment, and we must do it before Vale discovers whether his ledger of leaves has a page we have not yet read. As we descended the steps, the fog drew a grey veil across the garden, and somewhere beyond the hedge a church bell tolled the hour. Holmes paused, head bent like a hound that scents a change in the wind. Then with that long, eager stride of his, he cut into the mist, drawing me toward the next turn in the path he had already traced in his mind. The police conveyed Josiah Pike to a narrow room at the station, where the gas flared, and a scar in the deal table told of other nights and other fists. He was a wiry creature, with brick dust ground into the seams of his hands, and a pair of anxious, darting eyes that never quite met a man's gaze. Lestrade planted himself by the door with the air of a little sentinel cannon. Holmes remained standing, one hip against the table, studying Pike as a hawk might study a restless stoat. "You know who I am," Holmes said, not as a question. Pike swallowed. "Aye, I've heard of you, Mr. Holmes, they say as you could tell a man's dinner by the way he ties his neckcloth. Be comforted. Your neckcloth tells me only that you tied it in a hurry, and that your hand shook somewhat more last night than it does today." Holmes's tone was almost kindly. "We will begin with the coal cellar at Pilkington House." Pike's glance flew to Lestrade and then back. "I never laid a hand to the old gentleman," he blurted. "On my mother's grave I never did." "Perhaps not," Holmes returned. "But you laid a hand to the ventilator bolt, which is a hand too far, if you wish to be thought innocent of all but trespass. Who paid you to go by that route?" Pike moistened his lips. "No one paid." Holmes raised a languid forefinger. "You were not in that cellar for the pleasure of blacking your cuffs. Consider. A clerk's quarrel with a master might send a man to glare at a window, but it seldom sends him to master a ventilator. The thing took thought. You were not the thought." Pike's shoulders sagged, and with a kind of sullen relief he let the truth out in a rush. "It were a gent. Smart coat, neat cuffs, spoke soft. Met me by the Spaniards Road 2 nights back. Says as he's got a job for a lad what knows the tradesman's ways. Nothing dirty, says he, but secret. You can go in quiet, he says, and you know the lay of the cellars from your time there. He gives me a crown down, and another went was done." "His name?" Lestrade snapped. "He didn't say." "I'm no fool, but he smelled." Pike hesitated and glanced up at Holmes. "Like one of them barber's bottles." "Bay rum," Holmes murmured. "Go on." "He had a packet for me," Pike said, "a little tin with wafers and wax. If anything's left where it oughtn't, he says, you take it. If it's been burned, you'll look for the ghost of it. Them were his very words. There'll be a mark somewhere. He told me to watch the grate, the desk, and the big Bible like as sits on the corner. If you find loose leaves, he says, you fetch 'em me." Holmes's eyes were half closed. "The hour?" "10:30, Pike muttered. "I went by the area, through the vent. The cellar were quiet as a church. I come up cautious by the servants' steps, but afore I were halfway the light caught me, lantern in a hand not 2 yards off. I dropped and crawled, and the light went the other way. I waited for a breath and made for the area like a rabbit. I never got as far as the study." He looked wretchedly from one to the other. "I swear it afore God." Holmes's fingers made a little steeple. He regarded them as if they were pieces on a chessboard he did not yet choose to move. "Describe the gentleman again." "Clerk-like," said Pike, eager now to prove the little he could. "Smooth face. Hands white. Nails neat as a lady's." He spoke me a list besides to put in my head in case I saw a page as matched like a prayer it sounded. Genesis, first chapter of Matthew, Numbers, 11 and 7, 1 and 11, 5 and... He screwed up his eyes. I ain't book-learned, Mr. Holmes, but I had the tune o' it. Begat this and begat that. He said I'd know it when I saw the underlines. Holmes opened his eyes. Thank you, Mr. Pike. You have been, within the elastic bounds of your conscience, useful. Inspector, detain him on the trespass by all means, but do not trumpet him as your man. There is an ear on Hampstead Heath, listening eagerly for such fanfare. Lestrade scowled, but before he could retort, a sergeant thrust in his head with the breathless importance of a messenger bringing word of a breach in the line. Beg pardon, sir, telegram from the yard. Mr. Carberry, the solicitor, found in chambers, struck from behind. Not dead. Concussion, doctor says, but papers rifled. Clerk says a packet's missing. Something drawn yesterday for Mr. Pilkington Holmes's head went up like a hound's at the crack of a twig. The codicil, he said softly. Our quiet gentleman grows noisier. Inspector, order a cab. We go to Chancery Lane. We found Mr. Carberry in a narrow bed, his brow bandaged, his dignity in tatters, but still struggling to sit upright to receive us. The small clerk who had discovered him hovered in a corner, wringing hands that had never touched a coal scuttle. On the desk lay the wreckage of a tidy mind, the drawers prized, labels torn, papers released from their neat twine, like frightened pigeons from a loft. It is an outrage, Mr. Holmes, Carberry managed, the words quivering with injured professional pride. Assaulted in my own chambers by some ruffian? He had the key to the outer door. I can only suppose he duplicated it from a wax impression. He took the draft of Mr. Pilkington's codicil and the notes connected with it. Holmes moved through the debris without seeming to touch it. He left you alive, he murmured. A sentimental thief, or one who did not dare the gallows for murder twice in 2 nights. He bent suddenly and lifted from the fringe of the hearthrug a charred curl of paper. He spread it delicately upon a clean blotter, moistened a fingertip, and teased it open. The ghost of a printed line blinked up at us like a relic dredged from a riverbed. Jacob begat Joseph, Holmes read, and his mouth tightened. He cannot resist his little baptismal tokens. Carberry stared. A Bible leaf in my chambers? Good heavens! Our thief has a mania for genealogy, Holmes said, or a system. He salts his path with the crumbs of scripture to persuade us that a madman runs ahead of us. He is not mad. He is practical. He turned to the clerk. Who had access to your keys? No one, sir, no one, the man protested. I keep them in my pocket. Except when you hang your coat in the corridor. Step to the porter for a word, and a smooth-handed gentleman brushes against it, Holmes said, not unkindly. You have been careless, Mr. Perkins. There is no shame in it, only alertness to acquire. Now, what was in the codicil? Carberry coloured. I am not at liberty. You are at liberty to prevent a murder being varnished with legality, Holmes cut in. The man who took it will misquote it to his benefit unless we can quote the truth to his discomfiture. Speak, the solicitor's scruples fought with his sense, and sense, pressed by pain and outrage, won. Mr. Pilkington intended to revoke certain bequests to his son-in-law and to establish an annuity for Mr. Vale in lieu of a lump sum, he said stiffly. He likewise directed that some minor charities should be paid immediately to clear arrears. He was particular on that point. Holmes's eyes kindled. Particular because he had just discovered why the arrears existed. Good, very good. He looked, for a glinting instant, almost pleased. Then the grim mask settled again. You will write, from memory, a fair copy of that codicil, and bring it with you to Pilkington House at 8 o'clock this evening. We shall hold a reading, send notices to the family that the will and its appendages will be heard. Inspector, see that the invitations carry the authority of the yard. Suspicion will sharpen attendance. Lestrade's eyebrows leapt. A reading, with the murderer present to applaud? Precisely, Holmes said. When a man plays for papers, you must offer him paper and watch which way his eyes go. Meanwhile, Watson, we have errands. Mr. Carberry, my thanks. Guard your keys as you would your reputation. Both are in jeopardy. In the cab, he fell into one of those fits of concentrated silence which are to his thinking what the taut bowstring is to the arrow. I knew better than to speak. At Baker Street he went to his chemical table, but instead of lighting the burners, he took the Bible once more from its wrappings and laid it open where the missing leaves were most jagged. He drew from his pocket-book the scraps we had gathered, the charred curls, the postage-stamp shreds, arranged them as a mosaicist sets, tesserae, and bent until the smoke of his pipe was tangled with the ragged margin. Genesis, Matthew, Numbers, he murmured, tapping with the stem. 11 and 7, 1 and 11, 5 and... what? Pike could not recall. Not verses, Watson, pages. Pagination differs across editions, but not so very in the big family quartos. The page head I saw in the grate wore a figure with a 1 in the tens. Our man had a list, G 117, M 111, N 53, say, each page bearing underlines that read in order make He sprang up, crossed to his cabinet, and returned with a thin pamphlet, a stationer's catalogue. Pilkington was a subscriber to the Churchman's Family Bible, 1862 issue. The pages we have lost must correspond with that numbering. If I had the full, uninjured copy, I could reconstruct the list. In default, I must resort to inference. Jacob begat Joseph lies commonly about Matthew 1:16. What lies one page earlier? Names, always names, his eyes flashed. Names that match the minor charities, St. Bartholomew's Home, St. Swithin's Almshouse, St. Mark's Bread Fund. Initial letters underlined, S, 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 crossed with figures, payments due, shaved, diverted, Owen Vale's private ledger, hidden in God's. He paced, quick and feline, then stopped dead. He needed the leaves because they are the ledger. He needed the codicil because it outs his scheme while still giving him a Isolpe. He struck at Carberry to rewrite what fortune had already written against him, but, and here his voice sank, who struck Pilkington? Not Vale. He is too fine in the fingers. He draws blood with ink. Then who held the heavier instrument and the heavier grievance? He frowned. The blow was single, clean, as from a practised arm not used to fury, but to decision. The coal dust on the mantel said the hand had been there. The candle grease said the passage was dim. The hall clock's lying face said an hour was shifted. It may be, Watson, that our murderer believed he served a just cause, and if Vale stirred the pot, I said, he may yet coax another spoon to stir again. Holmes's mouth took that narrow, dangerous line. Then let us hold the pot over a livelier flame. All that afternoon he sent and received telegrams with the brisk economy of a field commander. One went to Dobson's in Holborn to confirm the dye of the altar candles and the account to which they had been charged. The answer came back, Saint. Mark's and Mrs. Clara Whitby's name upon the receipt for the pair she had mistakenly taken home. Another went to a certain broker's clerk in the city whom Holmes had once saved from penal servitude. From him came figures, Pilkington's recent sales, a private loan, and the note that Matthew Whitby had pressed his father-in-law hard for assistance on a speculation now gone sour. A third wire brought information as to Owen Vale's prior situations, 2 offices in which his skill had been praised, and his departure had followed, in each case, upon the discovery of small irregularities in petty funds, no charges, only discreet dismissals. Through it all, Holmes moved as a man might move among clocks he has wound and set, listening for the first to chime. At 6, he threw himself into an armchair, closed his eyes for 5 minutes by the glass, and then sprang up, renewed. "Dress, Watson," he said, "a sober tie." The play begins at 8. We were among the first to arrive. Jarvis received us with a gravity that made the house itself seem to hold its breath. In the morning room, we found Mr. and Mrs. Whitby, pale and set. Mr. Vale, immaculate, the faint sheen of bay rum respectful rather than insistent, and Lestrade, with 2 Plain-clothes men who looked as if they had been poured into their coats and left to set. Mr. Carberry came a few moments later, a clerk in his wake and a fresh copy in his hand, the codicil, written from memory, sealed with a wafer from that same little stationer's tin now resting in Holmes's pocket. Holmes had arranged the chairs in a half-circle facing the hearth. The Bible, restored to its place though terribly wounded, lay upon the corner of the desk, as if the dead man still presided over its lessons. The clock in the hall struck the hour with a decorum that made me shiver. Carberry read first the terms of the will, dry as dust, then the codicil, in his careful, colourless voice. When he came to the annuity for Owen Vale, I saw Whitby's jaw clench. When he reached the instruction to clear the arrears for the little charities, Vale's lip tightened by a hair's breadth and then smoothed. Holmes's gaze never left their faces. When the reading ended, a hush fell like ash. Holmes allowed it to settle. Then, very softly, he said, "There remains a paper the thief did not take." Every head lifted. Even Lestrade looked surprised. Holmes drew from his breast pocket not a paper, but a small envelope. From it he tipped 3 blackened scraps into his palm, then with a surgeon's delicacy laid them upon the Bible's gutted margin. They were trifles, a curve of a letter, a ghost of a number, a speck of graphite. And yet as he set them down he named them like witnesses called to the bar. "This," he said, touching the first, "was lifted from the grate, the tale of a name that stands on Matthew 1:16. This," the second, "hid in the cellar's skirting a Doyle begat," with the sequence that precedes it. And this, the third, fell from a solicitor's hearth today, left by a hand that cannot quite keep from marking its path. He looked up, and the keen light in his eyes made the little room suddenly too small. "They are nothing, and they are everything. For they tell us that a list was compiled and concealed, that it was traced by the dead man and destroyed by the man who feared it, and that the same hand struck at law today to forestall its consequences. One thing remains to complete the circle." He turned to Jarvis. "Bring in the hearth-poker from the study." Jarvis obeyed, puzzled, and placed the polished brass in Holmes's hands. Holmes balanced it along his palm and then, without warning, thrust it into the heart of the fire. Lestrade started. "Holmes!" "What?" "Patience," Holmes said. "We have admired its cleanliness. Let us learn how deep it goes." He waited until the metal warmed, then drew it out and breathed upon it. In the dimness, a shadow bloomed along the shaft, a darker film that ran, not lengthwise, but in a single broad band a hand's breadth from the knob. Holmes held it for all to see. "Blood," he said quietly, "wiped with a cloth and polished, with zeal, but not with knowledge of how metal and memory keep company. A single blow leaves a single band." For an instant the room was still. Then Matthew Whitby lurched to his feet. "What does this prove?" he cried hoarsely. "That a man used a poker? I told you I argued with him. He might have struck me. I might have warded him off. Why must it follow that I—" "Because your boots," Holmes interrupted, as cold as a north wind, "carry the grit of a place you had no errand to visit, the coal cellar, because the hall clock bears the caress of your thumb at 10:10 and of no one else's, because you would swing twice in anger, but whoever struck your father-in-law swung once, with decision. And yet—" He let the words hang, and his voice, when it came again, was softer. "And yet the hand that wiped the poker was a woman's." All eyes swung to Mrs. Whitby. She had not risen, she had not cried out. Only her fingers, white upon the chair-arm, betrayed the force with which she grasped herself. Holmes's tone was very low now. "Madam, you lit a blue candle outside the study door. When the door was forced, there was no candle within. And yet I found upon the poker a faint bloom of that very grease, a dye Dobson sells only to Saint. Marks and 1 or 2 others. You were in that room after your husband left and before the door was forced. You wiped the stain because you thought your husband had left it." She closed her eyes. When she spoke, It was in a voice that seemed to come from a long way off. "I heard their voices," she said. "I feared harm." When Matthew came out, his face, oh, Mr. Holmes, it frightened me. I went to the door and called. There was no answer. I went in. There must have been a few minutes in which it was not locked. And I saw my father on the floor. And the She pressed her hand to her mouth. "I wiped it because I thought. Her gaze darted for the first time toward Owen Vale with a look of sudden, dawning fear. But Matthew swore he had not. Holmes inclined his head, neither accusing nor absolving. "We shall learn who swore truly and who merely swore. The trap is baited, the players are in place. One step more, and the mask will drop of its own weight." He set the poker down very gently, as a man might lay aside a scalpel. The clock in the hall ticked. Outside, the fog pressed its face to the pane like an unwelcome listener. And in that hush I felt, as unmistakably as one feels the change in air before a storm, that the case had turned, quietly, decisively, toward its crisis. The silence that followed Mrs. Whitby's broken admission was so deep that one could hear the tick of the mantel clock as though it were the measured step of fate itself. Her hands still clutched the chair arm, but her eyes were fixed on her husband with a desperate imploring that only a wife whose soul is divided between fear and loyalty could show. Whitby's jaw worked, but no words came. Lestrade, with the eagerness of a man who sees his case neatly packed, drew breath to speak, yet Holmes forestalled him with a gesture as sharp as the flick of a whip. "Not yet, Inspector," he said quietly. "We have dust enough in the air without your stirring more." He turned back to Mrs. Whitby. "You entered the study, saw your father fallen, and found the poker stained. You believed it the work of your husband. You tried, in your loyalty, to shield him. That is clear, but tell me, was your father still alive when you entered?" She pressed her hands together, as if to still their trembling. I thought not." His eyes were open, but fixed. He did not stir when I called his name. I knelt, but there was no breath. "Then you heard no sound in the house? No footfall? No closing door?" She shook her head slowly. "Only the crackle of the fire." "I remember it too well." Holmes inclined his head. "You saw nothing else upon the desk?" "No paper? No leaf of scripture?" Her brow furrowed. The Bible was closed. There were ashes in the grate. Nothing more. Holmes regarded her for a long moment, then let her be. He turned instead upon Vale. The secretary sat very straight, his features composed, yet his fingers toyed with his watch chain in an unconscious betrayal. Holmes's voice, when it came, was almost conversational. "Mr. Vale, you have heard that your patron contemplated both an annuity for you and, simultaneously, an exposure of your small irregularities. You have heard of papers burned and others stolen. You were in the house before supper, and you returned by the cellar after. What have you to say?" Vale's lips curved into the faintest smile. "That you are ingenious, Mr. Holmes, but hardly infallible. You piece together fragments, yet fragments cannot condemn. You speak of irregularities, none were proved. You speak of my return, unseen, unrecorded. You weave conjectures into a net, but a net of conjecture has holes." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "A net has holes, yes, but fish are caught nonetheless. Consider what fish you are, Mr. Vale, too delicate for the mud, too sleek for the hook, yet driven by appetite to the bait. You desired that codicil, and when Pilkington proved obdurate, you sought to rewrite destiny with fire and theft. But murder is not in your wrist. Someone struck for you, or beside you, Whitby, who had stood silent till now, burst out. "And you mean me, sir? You mean that I killed my own wife's father for the sake of a speculation gone ill? Damn your insinuations!" "Not insinuations, Mr. Whitby," Holmes returned calmly. "Observations. You quitted the study at 10:10, yet the hall clock says otherwise. Your boots carried cellar grit, though you had no errand there. Your temper is quick, your need desperate, but your blow, if it were yours, would have been more savage, less clean, and when your wife found the body, you did. Not hurry to see, but let her face it alone. That is not the instinct of guilt, but of fear. Whitby's face flushed scarlet, then ashen. Fear, yes. Fear of what I might see, of what she might believe. I swear to you I did not strike him. Holmes looked from husband to wife, weighing them as a jeweller weighs gems, not by size but by inner flaw. Then he stepped back and addressed the room. There is one more piece to this puzzle. We have seen the arm that struck, the hand that polished, the brain that plotted, but we have not yet seen the purpose entire. The torn leaves tell us of a hidden ledger, the codicil tells us of a change of favour, the polished poker tells us of a loyalty misplaced. When these threads are knotted, the pattern will be plain. He drew from his pocket a slip of paper, freshly folded. I hold here the result of my telegram to the broker's clerk. Mr. Whitby, your speculation was in Argentine rails. You borrowed heavily, you pressed your father-in-law for aid. He refused. But more, he had already discovered that certain small funds meant for charities had been diverted. When you begged for assistance, he threatened exposure, and he told you he meant to add words to his will that very night. That threat was overheard, not only by your wife, but by your secretary. Thus, three motives met in one chamber: anger, fear, and calculation. Lestrade, impatient, burst out, "But who struck? You spin a web and leave us dangling." Holmes's gaze was like steel. "The blow was struck by Matthew Whitby." A gasp escaped Mrs. Whitby. Whitby himself reeled as though the words were another blow, but Holmes raised a hand before the inspector could clap irons on him. "Wait!" He struck, yes, but not in malice. He struck in defence. Listen, and judge he moved to the desk, laying his long fingers upon the Bible. Pilkington had the codicil before him. Vale returned by the cellar to snatch it. There was a struggle, silent, swift. Whitby entered at that moment, saw his father-in-law grappled, and snatched the nearest weapon. One blow felled the old man, but in striking Vale he struck Pilkington. Vale fled, leaving the codicil to be burned, the Bible to be mutilated, and suspicion to fall where he desired. "Lies!" Vale cried, springing to his feet. "I was not there, I never—" But Holmes's voice cut across his protest. "You were there. You left your scent upon the air, your ash upon the desk, your thumb upon the window. You paid Pike to fetch the leaves. You rifled Carberry's chambers, and you salted the path with scripture. You built a fortress of fragments, but every stone bears your mark. You did not strike, but you drove another to strike, and that, in law as in conscience, is guilt." The secretary's mask cracked then. His lips trembled, his hands, so fine and steady, shook. He tried once more to summon his composure, but the bay rum betrayed him, the memory of his ledger betrayed him, and, at last, the silence of the room betrayed him. He sank into his chair and buried his face in his hands. Holmes regarded him without triumph. "You will confess in time," he said softly, "but the truth already stands. Inspector, you have your man, not the hot-headed husband, not the loyal wife, not the discarded clerk, but the calculating secretary whose pen wrote theft in the margins of the Holy Book and who thought to bury his sin in ashes." Lestrade signalled to his men, who stepped forward. Vale did not resist as they took him. The room breathed again, though heavily, as though freed from a nightmare that yet left its chill. Mrs. Whitby clung to her husband's arm, tears streaming down her cheeks, while Whitby stared at Holmes with a mixture of relief and shame. Holmes turned away, his eyes upon the mutilated Bible. "Strange, Watson," he murmured, "how men weave their ruin from the very fabric that should save them. Scripture twisted into ledger, charity into theft, loyalty into deceit. And yet it was a wife's simple act, shielding her husband, that nearly smothered truth. Innocence, too, can obscure," I ventured. "And the torn pages, Holmes, will they be recovered?" "Some may," he replied. "Others are already dust." but we need them no longer. The verses are written in another ledger now, the record of a mind that sought profit in piety and found only judgment. He closed the Bible with a firm hand. Thus ends the case of the torn-away pages. Yet, as we left the house with the fog curling about the lamps and the night pressing close, I could not help but feel that the air still whispered with the crackle of that fire, and that somewhere in its ashes lay the ghost of a name or number, a fragment of truth never to be read except by the eye of God. We had scarce gone 20 paces from the house before Holmes slackened his stride so abruptly that I nearly collided with him. He stood a moment in the mist, head a little bowed, eyes shut, breathing in that slow, measured fashion I had learnt to associate with the changing of some inner alignment. When he spoke, it was to no one and nothing, as if his words were the steam thrown off by thought brought suddenly to the boil. "No," he said, "it rings false." "What does?" I asked. "The chord we have just struck. Vale is our architect of theft and of much mischief. On that point I am content. But the stroke, the single, workmanlike stroke, does not sing in his key, nor in Whitby's. We have taken a shape that fits, Watson, but it blurs at the edges. Clarity lies in edges." He turned at once and led me, not away, but back along the garden rail to the tradesman's gate. Jarvis himself opened it, as one who could not imagine being denied entry to his own dominion. "Mr. Holmes?" he said, startled. "Have you forgot?" "I forget very little, Jarvis," Holmes returned, gently. "Least of all the habits of a house." "Who winds the hall? Clock?" "I do, sir. Every night at 9. And who tends the fires and cleans the irons?" "That is my duty also, sir." Holmes nodded, as if a trifling curiosity had been satisfied. "We shall not trouble you long." We regained Baker Street by a route that seemed to violate streets and time. Once seated before our own hearth, Holmes fell into absolute immobility, save for the delicate tapping of his fingertips. I had grown used to the alternation of whirlwind and stillness that composed his working day. Yet there was, in this stillness, something like tension wire-drawn to a borderline quiver. At last he rose, crossed to his chemicals, and returned not with a reagent, but with the hearth-poker itself. He balanced it upon his palm and smiled without mirth. "What do you see, Watson?" "A band," I said, "which your breath revealed. A shadow in the metal where blood once lay." "And where is that band?" I considered. "A hand's breadth from the knob." "Precisely, and not at the tip." A nervous man, striking wildly, grasps low and overreaches. His mark lies toward the head. A practised hand, lifting for weight and control, takes the balance nearer the knob. That band is the signature of habit, habit with brass and iron. Who in that house lives by brass and iron? "Jarvis," I said slowly. "Jarvis," he echoed. Add to it the arc of soot I observed upon the fender, the curve that speaks of a swing that rose rather than fell. The victim was seated, the assailant stood to his left and behind, and, being shorter, he struck upward at the right temple. Whitby is the taller man. He would have struck down. Vale would have stabbed with a pen and fainted at the sight. Jarvis carries coals, he wipes irons, he winds clocks, he knows to a minute when doors are unlocked and when a spring will kiss a latch. He crossed to the mantel and laid the poker down as tenderly as a surgeon sets aside a scalpel. "And he loves his mistress," he added very quietly. "Loyalty is a sharper spur than greed." "You believe—" "I believe that, in the hour when Pilkington sat with Bible and codicil before him, and Vale had either just left or hovered like a shadow, a servant's conscience, heated for years in the furnace of a rigid house, took shape in a single, deliberate blow. I do not say premeditation, I do say decision. Afterwards, seeing what his mistress would suffer if suspicion fell where it most naturally must, he set his stage, the window's feigned persuasion, the clock's lying face, the polished shaft, a smear of coal where a gentleman would not go, and a touch of candle where a gentleman's hand would not know its own stain. He did not count on a secretary with fingers sticky for codicils, nor on a detective with a taste for soot. Holmes's eyes flicked to the clock. "He will come back," he said. "There is always one thread a tidy man cannot bear to leave trailing. The Bible is closed, but not empty. The skirting still keeps a crumb. A wafer tin sits a finger too far to the right on a shelf he has dusted since boyhood. He will come, when the house sleeps, to set some little thing straight. We shall be at home to him. By 9 that evening we were once more in Hampstead. Lestrade, who had expected his bed and not an order, grumbled but obeyed. At Holmes's direction he placed one man in the area, black as a well, another in the shrubs along the garden walk, and a third within the servants' passage, where a slit of light from a distant scullery lamp cut the gloom like a sword laid across velvet. Holmes and I took our place in the study itself, whose fire had been coaxed to a low, even glow. The room smelt faintly of bay rum still, ghost of our arrested secretary, but under it lay the stronger, homelier breath of coal and beeswax. Holmes had placed upon the desk the mutilated Bible, and at its side a sheet of clean paper beneath the blotting flap. Nothing else lay to hand save the poker, innocently returned to its stand. We waited. There is waiting that wastes a man, and waiting that wins him. Holmes belonged to the second kind. I have watched him sit the night through in a chair no more comfortable than a church pew, and rise at dawn as taut and bright as a drawn blade. I could not imitate him. The quiet and the slow pulse of the fire set all my nerves to jangling. Somewhere in the house a board creaked, the clock in the hall breathed, a log in the grate let go a long, soft sigh. At last, was it an hour? 2? Holmes's fingers gave the faintest twitch. I neither moved nor breathed, but every sense leapt. The handle of the door turned. It was tried with minute caution, as lovers use upon a nursery. Then, after a pause in which some inner calculation was completed, a small tool, delicately applied, persuaded the latch to surrender. The door slid inward the breadth of a hand, a shadow oozed through and stood, a part of the darkness, while the newcomer tasted the air. He carried no lantern. He knew this room. He took 3 soundless steps toward the desk and stopped, the silhouette of a head turning to mark the chair, the hearth, the window. Then he moved again, reached, and in the next instant Holmes had him, not violently, but as a snare takes a bird, sure, sudden, inescapable. "Easy, Jarvis," he murmured. "You will wake no one by whispering, but you will wake the dead if you struggle." There was a breath, the ghost of a groan, and then the old butler straightened within Holmes's grasp with a dignity that hurt me. He did not ask who held him. He knew. His first words, when they came, were not for himself. "Mrs. Whitby must not be frightened," he said. "If we go quietly." "We go," Holmes returned. "No farther than this chair." "Sit, Jarvis." The butler obeyed and folded his hands upon his knees. In the firelight, his face looked carved from some stubborn English wood. Oak, perhaps, scarred by decades of polish and smoke, but sound at the heart. "What did you come for?" Holmes asked. Jarvis's eyes flicked once to the Bible. "A leaf," he said. "There is always a leaf, sir. One sees it in one's sleep. It will not lie straight." Holmes inclined his head. "And before, when you moved the clock hand, and wiped the iron, and scuffed coal upon the mantel, and eased the window catch, those were leaves also, I think, things that would not lie straight." Jarvis shut his eyes for a moment, as if the litany of his own carefulness pained him. When he opened them, they were steady. "I have served this house 40 years, Mr. Holmes. I taught Miss Clara her letters out of that very book. I learnt the sound of the master's foot upon the stair, and the temper in the sound. I heard him say last night what he would do to Mr. Whitby. He was a just man by his own lights. He would have been cruel and called it justice. There are things a man who is not clever can do. He can stand between. Holmes's voice, when it came, was the more terrible for its gentleness. "Tell me how you stood." Jarvis swallowed. Mr. Vale had gone, and Mr. Whitby had come and gone. I took the coals as I was bid, and I saw the paper smoke in the grate. I knew Mr. Pilkington's mind. He had sent for Mr. Carberry. He meant to make words hard as iron. I thought, if he writes them there and then, they are done. I should have gone away. I did not. His breath shivered, then steadied. I spoke. I said, "Sir, for the sake of your daughter, be soft." He looked at me as he looked at any man who forgot his place. He said words I shall not say again. He set the poker between us, not to strike me, but to keep me from him, as if I were the dog. I am not proud, Mr. Holmes. I have bent my back more times than I can count, and thanked God for the bread. But there are moments a man's back will not bend. He put his hand to the bell to call me down. I put out mine. He raised the iron, no more than an inch, to move it from his papers. I took it, here. He reached without thinking and touched, with unfailing accuracy, the place near the knob where the hidden band lay. I struck him once, not to kill, but to end the moment. It ended more. He did not cover his face. He did not weep. He sat as if carved, and the silence deepened. Holmes's eyes had gone very dark. Afterwards, I saw what I had done. I saw, too, what would be said, by him if he rose, and by the world if he did not. I thought of Miss Clara. I did as seemed best to a dull man who has only his hands to think with. I locked the door when I went out, and later I helped force it when she called. I wiped what I dared. I set the clock. I am no scholar. I did not know there were marks to be seen by gentlemen's eyes. Only, for the first time his voice trembled, only the Bible. It was open. There were lines scrawled like the accounts in Mr. Vale's books. I could not bear it. I tore the shame out and burned it. That was a sin. I do not excuse it. But the thing would not lie straight. Holmes's hand, those fine, exact fingers, moved once upon the arm of his chair, and stilled. And Mr. Vale? Jarvis's mouth thinned. He came like a cat to a dairy. I do not know if he was there at the very moment. I heard stealth below and smelt his scent before the door was forced. He went by the cellar again later, for I found the bolt eased and the dust forked by a thumb. If there was a devil at my elbow last night, his hand wore a clean cuff. Holmes rose and paced once to the hearth and back, as if to discharge a force that could not otherwise be earthed. When he spoke again, it was to the room at large, though his words were for me as much as for the man before us. "You hear, Watson?" The geometry of the blow, the habit in the hand, the reconcilement of the locked door, the clock, the wax, the dust, they fit. And yet... He looked down upon Jarvis with an expression I had seen on his face before, only when he stood at the bedside of a child who had told him a lie to save his mother. And yet the law does not measure motive by inches and degrees. It weighs only that a life has been taken. Jarvis stood. "I am ready, sir." Holmes put out a hand, not to seize, but to halt. "You are ready to carry one weight. There is another. I will not see you carry alone." He went to the door and called, softly, for Lestrade. The inspector appeared with the speed of a man whose ear had never left the keyhole. His eyes sprang wide at sight of the butler seated, and Holmes standing composedly between them. "What's this?" he demanded. "The conclusion of your case," Holmes replied. "But before you clap irons on the best servant in Hampstead, you will hear him. And you will hear me. You have in custody a thief and forger who stirred the pot and then dipped bread in it. You have here a man who tells a plain story that matches the stubbornness of things. The law will do as it must. But there is one leaf left to set straight, and I will set it before you read judgment." Lestrade's gaze flitted from one to the other. in baffled irritation. "Speak plain, Mr. Holmes." "I will, in the morning," Holmes said. "Tonight you will do nothing but place a man at Jarvis's door and another at his mistress's, and you will sleep, if you can, in a chair. In the morning I shall show you why the man who struck cannot be called a murderer in the strictest sense, why the blow that felled was, by the perversity of chance, less than the cause of death, why, in short, there is one more fact in this house, the smallest and the least regarded, that makes the difference between the jail and a lesser doom." Lestrade's jaw dropped. "Holmes, if this is one of your infernal theatricals—" "It is the last act," Holmes said simply. He turned to Jarvis. "You will remain, on your word, in your pantry till I send for you. I will give you this night with your house. In the morning we will put the leaves in their page." Jarvis bowed, actually bowed, as to a master who had at last spoken in a tongue he understood. "On my word, sir, when we were again in the street, the fog had lifted enough to show a thin, wintry moon like a shilling worn smooth by too many hands." Holmes lit a cigarette and walked for some minutes without speech, the ember a single, steady star before his face. At last, I could not help exclaiming, "You have it entire, and yet you leave it hanging by a thread. What is this smallest fact?" He smiled sideways at me, and the old mischief, how rarely seen in such a case, flickered. "If I told you now, my dear fellow, you would write a dull chapter. Sleep on your curiosity, think of soot and of church candles, and of a man's habit with brass and iron, and think, too, of doctors who taste air as another man tastes wine. The answer is there." "You mean the surgeon's report?" I cried. "I mean the surgeon's nose," he said. "In the morning." We walked on. London lay quiet, as if the city itself had drawn its shawl up to the chin and closed its eyes against the chill. Beside me, my friend moved with the long, tireless stride of a man to whom the end is present even when the path is still underfoot. I confess that I burned to drag the word from him. Yet there was in his silence something of kindness, the kindness of a master who leaves his pupil the last sum to work for himself. And so, with my head full of coal dust and candles, and a faint, insinuating fragrance that seemed to float still in that study's air, I set my jaw and resolved to earn my morning's lesson. Dawn found us again upon the Hampstead Road, a pale wash of light thinning the fog so that hedgerows and lamps emerged like sketches waiting for the painter's hand. Holmes had slept, if at all, in the short, fierce snatches that pass for repose with him. He took neither coffee nor roll at Baker Street, but sat with his hat upon his knee and his eyes upon the window, as though some inscription upon the morning itself were becoming legible to him. When we alighted, Lestrade was already in the hall, rumpled and red-eyed, with a constable at Jarvis's pantry and another near the morning-room where Mr. and Mrs. Whitby waited in a silence that rang more loudly than words. "I hope," Lestrade began sourly, "that your promised miracle will stand daylight, Mr. Holmes. I have Vale cooling his heels, and a confession half-born in the butler's throat. If there is a third rabbit in your hat, produce it." "There is no rabbit," Holmes returned, hanging up his coat. "Only a small plain fact. Where is the surgeon who first viewed the body?" "In the study," said Lestrade, surprised. "Dr. Blount. He came again at my request. We found the doctor by the mantel, peering into the grate with professional distaste, as if death, even cold, might yet offend him by its informality. He was a spare, grey man with the skin of one who has learned to sleep in all weathers and the nostrils of a hound." "Dr. Blount," said Holmes at once, "when you examined Mr. Pilkington last night, what did you smell?" The question, so bald and odd, would have nettled many a practitioner. Blount merely looked up with a glint that suggested he, too, kept a private ledger of small facts. "Coal gas," he said. "Faint, but distinct. I remarked it to the inspector. I thought at first it was merely the room. These London studies stink abominably of it in winter. But there was more of it about the lips and hair, than the air should provide. "Just so," said Holmes. "And the colour of the hypostasis?" The doctor's eyebrow rose, brighter than one expects. I would not swear to the classic cherry tint in this light, but brighter, yes. "You hear, Inspector?" Holmes observed softly. "A doctor's nose and eye, doing their honest work." Now for the houses. He crossed to the wall where a brass sconce projected, a modern convenience badly mated to old panelling. Its little tap stood at right angle to the pipe. Holmes took his lens and examined the square that bore upon the spindle. "Fresh touch marks," he murmured, "a smear where grease spread and gathered dust and then was lately disturbed. And here—" He drew his nail across the square, and a fine powder came away. "A bloom of lamp black that does not match the rest. Someone tested a flame here recently, or failed to." He went to the desk and lifted the silver candlestick Jarvis had spoken of the night before. The candle within it was tall still, but the wick bore a curious rounded knob, pale as if powdered, rather than the little charred mushroom one sees when a flame is pinched or blown. "You will oblige me, Doctor," said Holmes, "by telling me what quenches a flame into this shape, a child's puff, a snuffer's cap, or a creeping poverty of air." Blount stepped closer, squinting with curiosity. "Not snuffed," he pronounced. "Not blown either, there is no soot curl. Suffocated, I should say." Holmes's eyes brightened. "Suffocated with the master of the house. Now, Inspector, attend." He drew from his pocket a handkerchief and held it for a moment against the gas tap, which he had turned a hair. He replaced the square to its former position with an exactness that would have satisfied a jeweller, then carried the handkerchief to the grate and touched a taper to it. It flared at once with that peculiar thin eagerness one sees when coal gas has kissed cotton. "I do not propose to choke us for the sake of demonstration," he said, turning the tap entirely off and opening the window 2 inches to clear the air. But last night the window was fast, the fire low, the study door shut, and the candle that Jarvis saw at 9:30 was dead by 10:45. Coal gas leaks. Doctor, coal gas kills without fuss. It makes bright blood in the dead and dull wits in the living. Mr. Pilkington sat with his book and his codicil. Someone, who had reason to wish him drowsy, turned a modern convenience the breadth of a finger. The room, poorly vented by that low fire, do you mark the backdraft, Watson, in the fall of soot upon the fender, grew foul. The master nodded. Then other hands acted, other motives collided. But the cause that sealed fate lay hissing almost noiselessly from brass. Lestrade tugged his moustache. "You mean to tell me he died of gas and not of the blow?" "I mean to tell you that the blow, as delivered, need not have proved fatal, and that the signs argue a man already half suffocated when iron kissed him. Dr. Blount, you saw the wound. What say you to a single clean fracture with less extravasation than one expects if the heart be working soundly?" Blount tilted his head, remembering. There was less blood than in many a street brawl cut. I ascribed it to the neatness of the stroke, but yes, if the circulation were failing, if the circulation were thriftily yielding to gas, Holmes finished. "The smallest fact, Inspector, the candle that died not by hand, the wick that speaks a language only a housekeeper and a doctor hear, the faint reek a surgeon notices and a constable forgets by morning. This is why I told you to wait. Jarvis struck, but his blow landed upon a man already leaving us. He must bear his part in what followed. He does not bear the whole." Lestrade's eyes slid unwillingly to Jarvis's door. "You'd have me let him go?" "I would have you do your office with intelligence," Holmes said, not unkindly. "Hold him to answer for what he has confessed, but do not write murder where the facts write manslaughter at most, and that mitigated by circumstance. The mind that made murder possible, coolly, deliberately, with a twist of a tap and a wait upon a clock, is another's." "Vale," Lestrade said at once, too quickly, as a man grasps a plank. "We have him. We have him for theft, tampering, and a wicked design," Holmes agreed. "Whether intent tips to murder depends upon how far he turned that square. Did he plan death, or a stupor in which he might burgle a paper. His conscience will blanch at the one and varnish the other. The law will weigh motive against act. But you need not fear a barren day. Vale is guilty of enough to satisfy your superiors thrice over. Meanwhile, there is one page left to read. He moved to the skirting near the bookcase where he had before teased a charred shred from the crack. With his knife, he explored farther along the join, patient as a miner sounding a seam. Presently he smiled and drew out a tighter roll, crushed to the thinness of a grass blade. "Not from Scripture," he said, smoothing it with infinite care upon the blotter. "From a note. See, Watson, the upstroke is the old man's, but the ink is thick where the hand laboured. Read in the morning, and a tale of cod." He meant to keep the deed till daylight. Our cat smelt cream and came too early. Dr. Blount, whose professional reserve had thawed in the heat of inference, tapped the silver stick. "You said Jarvis saw this candle burning at 9:30. When I entered at 11:15, it was cold and the air stale. If gas were escaping through the wall, sconce and the window fast, the candle must fail. Yes, I concede your point." Holmes inclined his head. "You concede nature's. I only interpret." From that point he moved with his accustomed precision, sending one constable with a note to the gas company to certify a leak in the joint, dispatching another to fetch a foreman from Dobson's to attest to the dye of the altar candles, a small corroboration that placed Mrs. Whitby's innocent hand by the door, and by contrast left the desk candle's suffocation unaccounted for, save by gas, and directing Lestrade to bring Owen Vale from his lodging-room to hear, if he dared, the quiet accusation of brass and wick. Before the secretary arrived, Holmes asked leave to examine once more the hall clock. He opened the little glazed door, turned the minute hand forward and back with a craftsman's tenderness, and then with his chalk revealed the ghost of a thumbprint where grease had taken the powder, as he had done in the dim hours before. He wiped the plate clean. "We will not need it again," he said. "Its lesson is learned. A man cannot falsify time without leaving a truer record where he touched it." Vale entered with his composure repaired, and his collar irreproachable. If the night's arrest had shaken him, the morning's toilette had hidden the tremor. The faint fragrance that had betrayed him before was again upon him, less bold, as if he had coached it to modesty. He bowed to Blount with automatic courtesy, and to Mrs. Whitby with a well-bred gravity that might have deceived angels. Holmes wasted no prologue. "Mr. Vale," he said, "we have traced hands and motives enough. We shall now consider a tap." He indicated the gas sconce. "At or about 10 o'clock last evening, someone who knew this room turned that square a trifle and left it. When you returned, by the cellar or otherwise, you found the master drowsy, the air foul, and your opportunity ripe. Did you mean him to die?" Vale's smile was exquisite. "You ask a clerk to answer a philosopher, Mr. Holmes. I meant nothing." I obeyed. "Whom?" Holmes asked, so softly that the room itself seemed to lean forward. A pause, fractional, but costly, to the man who allowed it. Vale recovered. "Necessity, Mr. Holmes. A poor counsellor, but a common one." Holmes's gaze passed over him as if he were a case in a cabinet, labelled and dry. "You will find," he said, "that necessity is no defence to the coroner. Inspector, you will lay before the jury the doctor's testimony as to odour and colour, the condition of the wick, the state of the tap, and the backdraft upon the fender. You will add the witness of 2 men, one from the gas company and one from Dobson's, and the confession of Jarvis as to his stroke and his after devices. You will then ask the jury whether the blow killed, or whether a gentleman's finger upon a square set death's chair, and placed the iron only as a footstool." Lestrade nodded, for once subdued. "And if the jury says what you wish it to say?" "Then Jarvis will stand where he should, answering for that which he did, not for that which another prepared. And Mr. Vale will find that a ledger written in bagats and a ledger written in brass entries to the same page. Whitby, who had sat as if bound by a spell, struggled to his feet and faced Jarvis where he stood guarded at the door. "Jarvis," he said thickly, The old man bowed to him, not humbly now, but as one Englishman to another when the matter is at last plain between them. "Sir," he said, "I did what I dared." Holmes, who watches faces as other men watch the weather, allowed the moment to pass without comment. He had, I think, a tenderness for loyalty, even when it blunders into crime. He turned instead to Mrs. Whitby. "Madam," he said with a rare softness, "you told me yesterday that you placed a candle in the sconce outside the study door. You were precise, and without knowing it, you were crucial. Because of that little accuracy, for which most men would not have troubled, you have saved an innocent hour for your husband, and this morning you save a life from the noose." Her hands went to her eyes with a small, stifled sound. The relief that swept her was as eloquent as any thanksgiving. Holmes drew his watch. "The coroner sits at noon," he said briskly. "We have time to take our proofs by the hand and present them in order. Dr. Blount, if you please, you will accompany me to the gas company's office and then to Dobson's. Inspector, keep Vale where he cannot nudge the world again with his little finger. And keep Jarvis upon his word." As we quitted the room, I lingered an instant by the mantel and looked upon the poor, desecrated Bible. It lay as we had left it, dignified even in its wounds. The 3 blackened specks Holmes had arrayed upon its margin seemed like planets placed in their courses by a delicate law I could not see. I felt, as I have often felt in those investigations, that my friend dealt not with villains and victims only, but with the moral draughts and eddies that run through households as winds run between eaves. In the cab, Holmes sat with his hands deep in his pockets and his head back, his eyes half closed, in that expression of half-wearied amusement which in him is the nearest approach to relaxation. "You see, Watson," he said at length, "why I would not end the play last night. It is a poor melodrama in which the 3rd act kills the wrong man. We have written a better one for the jury. You had me upon thorns," I admitted. "Coal gas. The very odour was in your first description of the room, and yet I—" "Smelt tobacco," he finished dryly. "And so did I, but I remembered a surgeon once telling me that a city doctor must learn to taste air as a countryman tastes water. He will die of the difference if he does not. Dr. Blount has that palate. It needed only the candle to corroborate him. You infer the candle's manner of death from its wick." "I verified it at Baker Street," he said, with a flicker of boyish pride that sat well upon him. "A gas jet half a turn, a door shut, a silver stick, and a very dull evening improved by experiment. It is astonishing how instructive a wick can be when suffocated." He closed his eyes again, and for a few minutes the cab's rattle and the city's waking mingled in a rhythm that matched the steady contentment that comes to him when a case lies nearly under his heel. If he felt pity for Vale, he did not show it. If he felt pity for Jarvis, he masked it beneath efficiency. But when we had done with gasmen and candle sellers and returned at last toward Hampstead with affidavits in our pockets and the morning run half its course, I saw him glance once toward the pale sky with a look that said, more clearly than any exclamation, that a little clean air does a man good after a night in which brass and breath have been ill-used. The coroner's court had been set for noon in a bare chamber off the vestry at Hampstead, a place of pale walls and indifferent benches where dust rose visibly in slanted light. A dozen local men made up the jury, shopkeepers and a greengrocer among them, with the grave, slightly self-important faces that Englishmen wear when called upon to sit in judgment upon their betters. Lestrade fussed at the table with a stack of papers. Jarvis waited under guard, upright and without complaint. Mr. and Mrs. Whitby sat together, hands tightly joined, and Owen Vale, composed to the last crease, took a place where he could command the room with his profile. Holmes went at once to the coroner, a dry little man, and spoke a few quiet words. Whatever he said was sufficient, for the official nodded, pursed his lips, and announced that after the formal identifications, Mr. Sherlock Holmes will be permitted to put certain questions to assist the jury, The machinery ran. Jarvis identified the body as his master's. Mrs. Whitby confirmed the finding of the locked study. Lestrade summarized the police sequence with a brevity that did him credit. Then Dr. Blount called, gave his evidence in that crisp, unemotional tone by which a medical man strives to keep his humanity from colouring his fact. I found a fracture of the right temporal bone consistent with a single, heavy blow from a blunt instrument, he said. The wound could cause death. There was, however, less bleeding than often accompanies such fractures. The skin and mucous membranes bore a brighter tinge than one expects. The room smelt faintly of coal gas, and the wick of a candle on the desk, though long, showed the rounded, pale knob one sees when a flame dies for want of air rather than by snuffer or breath. "A candle's wick?" inquired the coroner, with a sceptical twitch. "A candle's wick," Blount returned, with that mild obstinacy which is science's better half. "I do not pretend infallibility. I state the signs as I found them. Very good. Mr. Holmes?" Holmes stepped forward as if a lecturer called to his diagram. He did not harangue. He placed upon the table the silver candlestick from the study, the poker, and a square brass tap removed, at the gas company's leave, from the wall sconce. Then, taking each in turn, he addressed the jury as if they were intelligent men, which under that treatment they became. "You will observe," he said, holding the candlestick to the light, "that the wick ends in a pale rounded head without the little frill of soot. This, gentlemen, is the sign of suffocation. The gas tap," he raised the square upon its spindle, "bears two traces. First, lamp black upon the face where a trial of flame left a powder. Second, a smear in the corner that is not dust but a translucent gum. Gutta percha, softened. I will show you presently how we match it. The poker," and here he breathed upon the shaft, and the dim band bloomed, "carries the ghost of blood in a single broad ring near the knob. A man of habit who lifts weight for control grasps there. A man who snatches grasps higher. The blow to Mr. Pilkington rose from below. The coal dust upon his mantle and the arc of soot on his fender say as much. He stood back. I shall call 3 witnesses. Mr. Dalby, of the gas company. A square-shouldered foreman smelling of tar and iron came and, with rough courtesy, testified that a soap test at the joint had blubbered with bubbles, that with the window fast and the fire down, a leak could foul a room within the hour, that a man might become drowsy and his candle fail as the oxygen was stolen. "We see it," he concluded, rubbing his knuckles, "when housemaids stuff rags under the door for a draught." Mr. E. Flynn, of Dobson's, a conscientious little man with ink on his fingers, affirmed that the altar candles sold to St. Mark's and lately charged to Mrs. Whitby were dyed faintly blue, whereas the desk candle in court was common white. The blue grease Holmes had found on the poker, therefore, had come from without the room, from the sconce in the passage. "It tells me only where the lady stood," he said, with a nervous bob toward Mrs. Whitby. Holmes inclined his head to him and then to Lestrade. "Inspector, Mr. Vale's effects, if you please, Lestrade," who had never wholly forgiven Holmes for anticipating his conclusions, brightened perceptibly as if grateful for a cue. From a brown envelope he produced a neat penknife and laid it upon the table. Holmes opened the smallest of its blades and with his lens showed the jury a dull translucence clinging near the hinge. "Gutta percha again," he said. "It dissolves in chloroform." From his pocket he took a tiny bottle and let a drop fall upon the blade. The gum relaxed and spread with that peculiar perfumed tackiness one notes in the dentist's mould. He then touched the same solvent to a flake from the corner of the gas tap square and watched it soften in the same way. "2 smears," he said quietly, "of the same stuff. You have already heard from last night that gutta percha was used to steady a blade beneath the study window's catch. Our man does work with neat hands. He steadies tools with gum when a squeak will betray him. He does not carry coal, he does not rue his cuffs, he carries a penknife, he leaves Turkish ash, he smells by others' noses than mine of bay rum. The coroner, impassive, folded his hands. Mr. Vale, will you step forward? Vale came. If the demonstration had disturbed him, he hid it as a dancer hides fatigue. He made the smallest of bows. You know the room? The coroner asked. I do, sir. I served Mr. Pilkington there nightly. Did you turn the gas tap? I did not. Holmes's voice slid in like a rapier. Did you steady a blade with gutta-percha upon the square? I do not carry gutta-percha, Vale said smoothly. If my knife is sticky, it is from citrus I took at luncheon. There was a ripple in the room. Holmes let it pass unrebuked. Did you encourage Josiah Pike to enter by the cellar? I do not encourage the underworld, Vale replied with a ghost of humour. It needs none. Holmes made a little movement with his fingers, and then, as if changing his mind, asked no more. The coroner did. He probed at the edges of Vale's evening, at his coming and going. Vale held to 9:30 and the landlady's clock. The landlady, called and flustered to be so, placed him at her stair before 10. It was all so nearly plausible that I felt, with a prickle of admiration and distaste, how slippery a well-spoken lie can be when it takes the arm of a truth. Jarvis, last, gave his plain tale. He did not embroider, he did not excuse. He told of the harsh word, of the iron lifted and taken, of the blow meant to end an instant and ending a life. His voice did not break until he spoke of the Bible. Then it dropped, and he used a single, old-fashioned phrase that brought a sting to my own eyes. I could not bear, he said, to see God's book made a book of sums. When all had been heard, and the trifles laid, the coroner summed up with sensible clarity. Gentlemen of the jury, he said, it is for you to say how Mr. Pilkington came by his death. If you are satisfied that coal gas escaping from a tap rendered him insensible, and that a subsequent blow delivered without malice but with sufficient force hastened that death, you may find accordingly. You will consider, too, whether any person's act in causing the gas to escape was done with intent to endanger life. They withdrew. A murmurous half-hour passed, marked for me by Holmes's absolute stillness and Vale's exquisite poise, which did not falter once. Mrs. Whitby sat with her hand in her husband's and her eyes lowered. Jarvis looked at the long nails of his right hand as if he had never truly seen them. The jury returned. We find, said their foreman, that the deceased died from the effects of coal gas poisoning, accelerated by a blow to the head. We attached to Jarvis, the butler, the responsibility for the blow under great provocation and with no clear intent to kill. We recommend him to mercy. As to the gas, we are of opinion that it was turned on by some person, unknown, with intent to facilitate theft, and we leave it to the police. There was a little stir. It meant safety from the rope for Jarvis. It meant a door left ajar for Vale. Lestrade, who had anticipated a verdict of a simpler sort, took a moment to adjust his features. He then rose and asked that Jarvis be committed upon the coroner's warrant for trial on a charge of manslaughter, and that Owen Vale be remanded upon charges of burglary at the solicitor's, of embezzlement and fraud, and of feloniously interfering with a gas fitting with intent to commit felony. The coroner nodded, the clerk scraped, the constables moved. It was then that Holmes made his only mischief of the day. He touched the coroner's sleeve and obtained, by that soft authority which attends him like a cloak, leave to ask one final question. "Mr. Vale," he said, "will you oblige me by emptying your cigarette case upon the table?" A flicker, only that, but to an eye which had watched 1,000 masks it was a curtain stirred by wind. Vale hesitated the fraction of a second too long, then smiled as one indulges a child, and complied. A dozen slender Turkish cylinders rolled out in a little tide, and with them, lodged as a stiffener between the case's lining and lid, a slip of paper no larger than my thumb and forefinger together. Holmes took it. He did not look triumphant, he looked inevitable. He laid it beside the candlestick. Even in that small scrap, char coaled along one edge and thumb-smudged along the other, one could see a column of small names in printer's type, a ladder of begats, and along the margin a hairline of graphite where some names had been touched and others passed. At the foot, in a newer hand, 2 initials, O.V. There was a sound in the room like air leaving a man. Vale's suavity sagged. He put up his hand as if to adjust his cuff, found nothing there to straighten, and let it fall. Holmes addressed the coroner, not Vale. "The torn leaves are a ledger," he said, "when I told Mr. Vale so last night." He smiled. "When I reconstructed enough this morning to prove it," he smiled again. But he could not bear a leaf in the wrong place. He carried one with him, as a neat man carries a blotter's corner to keep his page, an old habit that betrayed a new crime. The law will have the rest from his lodging. Lestrade, in whom the hunt surmounted the paperwork, jerked his head. "Carter, search his rooms again, thoroughly." The coroner, who had watched with more interest than his impassivity allowed, made his final notes. Jarvis was led away without resistance, and with that small, battered dignity that is the best armour of an honest man in trouble. Mrs. Whitby, at last permitted to weep without shame, bent her head upon her husband's shoulder, and Owen Vale, still astonishingly trim, went out between 2 officers, his face once more composed, but the skin about the mouth a trifle grey. A desk, a wafer tin, and a little roll of gutta, what looks like the same you showed. Lestrade's moustache bristled as if electrified. "That will serve very well," he said, and for once he clapped Holmes upon the shoulder like a friend at a match. Holmes accepted the contact with equanimity. "Return them to the house," he said. "We will lay them where they were torn from, and let the book forgive us if it can." In the afternoon, we did precisely that. Holmes, with a tenderness I had seen him reserve for violins and sick children, slid each rescued leaf into the gap its ragged root declared. He did not look at the margins as he did it. He had no need. He had already read the hand that wrote upon them, Greed in small graphite, parading as charity. When we had done, and the Bible lay whole enough to keep a place, Holmes replaced it upon the desk and stood for a time with his hands behind him, gazing down as if at a grave newly filled. "Is the case done?" I asked at last. He roused himself as from a reverie. "Nearly. There remains to tell the story so that even Scotland Yard can understand it." The laugh was only in his eyes. "Come, Watson. Tonight in Baker Street we will put our chapters in order. Tomorrow the Yard will claim the preface." And though outwardly the pieces lay snug, Jarvis held, Vale charged, Whitby at liberty, Mrs. Whitby's tears turning at last to speech, I knew my friend too well not to feel that in his mind one page still fluttered. He would, after his fashion, pin it down with reason, and with words so plain that even a jury of shopkeepers could not mistake the moral. It was the work he loved best, not the blow or the chase, but the clear, cold summing up in which motive is weighed and misdirection stripped. As we turned our faces toward the city, the lamps flickered to life one by one, and the fog, which had thinned to gauze, drew itself primly again across the streets. Holmes walked fast, and I matched him, knowing that before the night was out, the whole truth would be set upon the page. That evening in Baker Street, Holmes sat me where the lamplight fell full upon my notebook and arranged his exhibits upon the table with the scrupulous order of a lecturer setting out his trays. The poker lay to the left, the square of the gas tap to the right, the silver candlestick between. Behind them, as if presiding over the array, the family Bible with its newly restored leaves, the raw margins hidden, the wounds decently stitched. He did not begin at once. He filled his pipe, struck a match, and watched the flame eat the sulphur to a clean blue before he set it to the bowl, as if, having fought gas and wick all day, he must first make a private peace with fire. "You will want it consecutive," he said at last. "So will Lestrade. If I do not give it him in a straight line, he will draw one with a ruler and spoil the curve. "You have your audience," I said. "Begin where the line truly starts." "At 9:30, he returned, because Jarvis's eye is a clock and I trust it. He enters with coal. He finds the master seated with Bible and papers. A tall candle burns in the silver stick. "Before that, mister." Vale has been present with letters. He carries away Pilkington's signature and the knowledge that a codicil sits in the old man's mind like a pebble in a shoe. He leaves by the door, but not before his finger has taught the wall sconce a bad habit. Just a hair's breadth, Watson, enough to bid coal gas creep. He tapped the little brass square with his pipe stem. From that moment the room begins to fail. The window is fast. The fire is low and drawing poorly. There is your arc of soot upon the fender. The oxygen thins. A man grows dull, not drunk. Presently Whitby comes hot with his loss. He argues. He is refused. He goes. By 10:20 the master nods. The candle, having fed from a dying air until there is no breath left to share, perishes with that rounded pall upon its wick which Blount knows as a suffocation and a constable overlooks as a trifle. The door is shut. The room now is a chamber where one man may do many things with little fear of interruption. "You set Vale there," I said, returning by the cellar. "I set his kind of man there," Holmes answered, "the kind who steadies a blade with gutta-percha so a square will not squeak, who smokes Turkish and leaves a pinch of ash under another's cigar, who is too fine to break a lock but not too fine to walk through a ventilator. Our Josiah Pike he hires for the lower work, to fetch leaves if any remain, or to pluck the ghost of a letter from a blotter, but Pike has the luck to meet a lantern and a conscience that will not quite blacken. He scuttles. The gentleman goes on. He finds the master drowsy, possibly out, possibly murmuring. He takes what he can, blot a page, draft, a leaf if it lies, and then, at the moment when he thinks Providence has hushed the house for him, the smallest spring in the whole mechanism flies. "Jarvis," I said. "Jarvis," he echoed. Jarvis, who has listened to hard justice for 40 years and has learnt where obedience ends and loyalty begins. He speaks. He is dismissed like a dog. The iron lies between them. The hand that has known every weight in the house finds the balance and rises from below. One blow, only one. You saw the band on the shaft where habit grips for control. The result is not the result he intended. He is not a man who forecasts the colour of hypostasis or the rate of bleed. He sees only that the instant he dreaded has ended and all the worst that could follow has begun. Then the tidying begins. The clock's face turned to a convenient lie, the polished iron, the faint at the window, the little coal smears for a story the world will easily believe. And over all of it, that one sickening thread of gas whispering out of brass, turning what would have been a murderous blow in law into a blow upon a man already leaving this world. He rose and, as if he could not keep still when the whole geometry lay within him, crossed once to the window and back. "Afterwards," he went on more briskly, "our thief becomes our burglar." He snatches at Carberry's chambers and steals a draught that memory replaces before luncheon. He carries a leaf in his cigarette case because a neat man cannot endure a page without its marker. He tells himself he has meant no death, only a stupor and a theft. The law may debate the difference. I am not the law. We were interrupted then by Lestrade, who came in with the apologetic boldness of a man who expects to be laughed at and hopes to deserve praise. He sank into a chair with a grunt and set his hat upon his knee. "The yard is content," he announced, half defiant. "Jarvis remanded as you wished, with the jury's mercy tied to him like a bell. Vale held for enough to keep him for a winter. Carter's haul from the lodgings grows. There's your wafer tin. There's a scrap of the codicil in his basket, charred like the others, and a note to Pike naming the Spaniards. Road, you will not find me ungrateful for a bone when a friend brings the joint." Holmes smiled that thin smile of his, which neither flatters nor offends. "You have done your share, Inspector. Tell your superiors the case will read well in the reports if they print the candle." Lestrade snorted. "Candle! You and your trifles. I shall never sit a room again without sniffing like a hound. If my wife complains, I shall refer her to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Do, said Holmes. She will find me as useful as the barometer. He glanced to me. Put it down, Watson. The true misdirection lay in piety, the Bible torn, the begats paraded as madness. The second lay in the rough trade, coal, window, cellar, thrust forward so the gentleman's little square should pass unnoticed. The third was time itself, 10-10 pinned like a butterfly. But trifles, Inspector, trifles repair the balance, a wick's head, a smear of gutter, a faint perfume, a thumb's ghost on brass. I confess I am fond of such trifles. They keep a man honest. Lestrade rose with a grunt and took up his hat. You keep the city honest, Mr. Holmes, or as near as any man can who is not paid for it. If the yard owns you a pint, you shall have it, so long as you do not take your violin to the public house. When he had gone, Holmes stood for a moment smiling to himself, then fell to pacing again with his hands behind him, and his chin sunk. There remains the moral, he said, half to me and half to the fire. I do not often preach, it is not my parish. But it strikes me that a modern devil went to church last night and took a pew, neatly turned and polished by a gas-fitter. Men cry out that their grandfathers did not die of such conveniences, their grandfathers did not turn little squares and trust the air to keep their secrets. And the old sins, I ventured, keep their old shapes. Greed writes as neatly now as when Judas ran a bag. He looked round, amused. Very good, Watson. I will have you ordained yet. He tapped the Bible lightly. This book has been used for worse codes than Mr. Vale's ledger. Pilkington had the sense to see his error at the last. His plan to mend it with an annuity came too late to save him, but in time to expose the parasite. In another house, at another hour, the whole would have passed for a family quarrel with a drunken servant to wear the blame. We are all more brittle, I think, where our virtues stiffen us. We sat a while in an ease that comes to two men who have rowed their boat through a chop, and now hear the oars drip without hurry. The city beyond our windows made its usual evening murmur. Mrs. Hudson's tread, familiar and orderly, passed the door. The coal in our grate gave a friendly shift. At length I asked what became of those rescued leaves. In the drawer of Mr. Carberry's safe, he said. They will be produced to convict a clerk and to shame a fashion. If Mr. Vale escapes the gallows upon the gas, he will find it harder to escape the ledgers. The court has an appetite for paper, and Jarvis? He considered. He will plead to manslaughter with all the weight the coroner has put upon the cause. A month ago, I would have said 12 months with hard labour. Tonight, after I have watched a jury read a wick, I will hope for less. There is a generation of Englishmen left who know what service means. The judge may be one. He took up his violin then, not to storm or exult, but to let his bow move in a slow, meditative line that reminded me of the fog lifting from the heath at dawn. Presently he stopped and laid the instrument across his knee. You remarked, he said, that I began to suspect at the poker. It was the band, yes, but more the height of the band. Men announce their trades when they lift things. A blacksmith holds near the head, a parlour-maid pinches daintily, a butler takes the weight. And then there was that little question I put to Mrs. Whitby Candles. Civility, in this case, convicted cunning. Her one accurate recollection gave me a colour no thief could counterfeit. You set your snare last night expecting Jarvis? Expecting a tidy man, he said. It is a mercy for my profession that criminals, small and great, cannot bear a misaligned object. They tidy themselves into jail while the clumsy escape. We laughed together over that, and then he grew grave again and took the Bible in his hands. He turned to Matthew and ran a finger down the column of names, not irreverently, but with that air he has when he reads a code or a schedule, a respect for pattern wherever he finds it. Do you know, he said. "I am almost grateful to Mr. Vale for his ledger." It reminded me that even a monotonous list contains bearings if a man has the trick of seeing them. The Bagats have guided kings and triflers both. They guided us today to a penknife and a tap. He closed the book and replaced it upon the table. "Write it cleanly, Watson," he added with that kindly superiority which I have never resented. "Leave Lestrade the credit that is his and me only that which is mine, an eye for candle wicks and a nose that listens when a doctor speaks. Spare Jarvis the gall, he has swallowed enough. As for Mr. Vale, the law will make its own sermon, and I shall not improve upon it." Later, as the street fell quiet and the coals settled at last, he stood at the window with the curtain a finger's breadth aside, looking down upon Baker Street as if it were a chart in a glass. "There is a comfort," he said softly, "in a case that ends where it ought, with the guilty man answering for calculation, not with a faithful fool dangling for it. The world is not just, but one can, now and then, persuade it to behave as if it were." He let the curtain fall, and the lamplight made his profile keen against the dark. "Come, Watson. I have starved a day. There is a chop downstairs that will not suffocate, and I will answer Mrs. Hudson's bell as cheerfully as I answered Jarvis's. In the morning, if Providence wishes me amused, I shall have a tradesman's quarrel and a lost umbrella, but tonight I shall eat, and you shall write." So ended the matter of the Bible with pages torn away. If, in the years that followed, I found myself, when entering a close room in winter, glancing first at the gas tap and then at the candle's head, I have to thank my friend's obstinate faith that truth resides as much in the smallest wick as in the largest flame. And if I have, in this account, made more of a servant's conscience than of a clerk's cleverness, it is because I saw in Jarvis, as Holmes saw, the battered plainness of an English virtue that does not preach and does not pose, but, when driven, stands, and having stood once, sits down again to take whatever comes. It was some weeks later, on a clear, hard morning, when the wind had scoured the town and the sun picked out every flaw in the Baker Street panes, that the last threads of the matter were knotted. I had just laid aside my stethoscope when Holmes, who had been skimming the correspondence with his long forefinger, flicked across to me a note in Lestrade's compact hand. "Our friend at the Yard grows positively literary," he observed. "He writes a conclusion fit for your pages." The letter stated, with official dryness insufficient to mask its satisfaction, that Owen Vale had stood at the sessions on charges of embezzlement, burglary at the solicitor's chambers, and malicious interference with a gas fitting in furtherance of felony. The judge, a spare, frosty man whom I had seen treat rogues as a gardener treats nettles, had directed the jury that while the coal gas and the candle spoke loudly against any innocent intent, the law would not hang a man upon the doubtful border between stupor and death. Vale was found guilty upon the several counts that needed no such border, and received 7 years' penal servitude. Of Josiah Pike, the court took a rough view and a lenient hand, 3 months for trespass, with a warning that the first honest job he refused would earn him 6 more. "And Jarvis?" I asked, though I had already skipped to the paragraph which must contain his fate. Holmes was watching me over the paper with that look he gives a patient who is about to hear better news than he expects. "Read it, Watson." The coroner's verdict having done its merciful work, Jarvis had been put up for manslaughter. The case was tried with a brevity that made me marvel how seldom the law is brief when it might be, and long when it ought not. Lestrade wrote that the judge, in whom there must have dwelt, somewhere under the bone and wig, a memory of service rendered without advertisement, remarked upon the jury's recommendation, upon the gas, and upon the single, deliberate stroke of a man unused to violence. He inflicted a sentence that would not disgrace the court's sense of order nor exhaust the prisoner's strength, 9 months, with the last 3 remitted if conduct were good. "Better than I dared hope," I said. "As always," Holmes returned, "truth did for us what rhetoric could not." A wick's head is a poor advocate until one teaches the court its language. He had scarcely spoken when Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor, and in the doorway appeared Jarvis himself, thinner and greyer than when I had last seen him, yet with that same stubborn dignity which no jailer's key could turn. He stood upon the threshold until Holmes waved him to a chair. "I could not wait, sir," he began, and the tremor that had not mastered him in the witness box now shook his voice. "They gave me leave to come before I go north. Miss Clara, Mrs. Whitby, requires me no more in the house. You have stood between once, she said to me, and you shall not stand between again. This time you shall sit by a fire that is your own. She has taken a small cottage near her husband's works in Leeds, and there is room there." He broke off, and the old habit reasserted itself. He folded his hands upon his knees and steadied his tone. "It is not my place to speak of their affairs, sir, but you will be glad to know he has found honest employment. There is to be no more rail speculation, the charities too." He glanced at me as if asking pardon for the familiarity. "The arrears are cleared. She sent double, and the vicar read, last Sunday, that it was in memory of her father." Holmes's eyes softened. "That is a woman's arithmetic," he said. "It balances what men cannot." Jarvis drew from his coat a parcel done up with the scrupulous neatness of his class. "If you will accept this, sir," he said, and placed upon our table a stout family Bible, new, its leather scented faintly of the binder's shop. "It is not for reading by such as you, who have better books. It is for your shelf, to say that a poor servant who was taught his letters out of that book did not forget the gentleman who read them rightly when they had been misused." Holmes rose and, to my surprise, bowed over the gift with a gravity one might have thought excessive in a man so little given to ceremony. "I will keep it," he said simply, "for its margin." When Jarvis had gone, refusing luncheon with that obstinate humility which is pride in a better case, Holmes stood for some minutes with his hand upon the new volume, his gaze far beyond it. "You mark," he said at last, "how order reasserts itself when a single false entry is erased. Vale's neat vices had set every figure in that household awry. Remove him, and one sees the balances creep back towards their proper columns. It is the same with music. A violin will sound out of tune if a single string is slack, and the hand that corrects it must listen for the one that is wrong, not saw away at them all. We heard in due time that Vale had not prospered even in disgrace. A letter from Lestrade, smug to the point of benevolence, reported that a further search of the secretary's effects had produced a little private cipher in which the initial letters of sacred names stood for sums, that a few well-to-do subscribers, learning how their benevolence had been trimmed, made it their business to see his sentence neither shortened nor softened, and that the warders had already taken a dislike to a gentleman who corrected their accounts in pencil. Pike, for his part, kept his word and his temper. A year later, meeting Holmes by chance in the Strand, he saluted with a kind of abashed pride, and reported that he now carried coal openly and took his beer in a house whose gas jets he left strictly alone. Of the Whitbys we heard little more, which, in a marriage that has survived a crime, is generally a good sign. I chanced once, on a summer errand, to pass St. Mark's at Hampstead, and saw upon the harvest table 2 altar candles in their blue dye, clean, upright, and innocent. A brass plate at the door recorded a gift to the poor in memory of Ezra Pilkington, and when the choir sang the recessional, a woman I took to be Mrs. Whitby stood without and listened, not going in, but with that look upon the face which a soft wind can bring to a field after storm. We were at our own fire again some months afterward, when a small circumstance brought the case back to us with a vividness I had not expected. A tradesman had fitted a new sconce upon Mrs. Hudson's landing and, with the economy that does not so much save coal as postpone bills, had left the joint ill-mated. I found Holmes, returning from an absence, stooping to the tap with his lens, his nostrils pinched, and his expression that of a man greeting an old enemy with perfect courtesy. "You see," he remarked, turning the square a hair to prove his point and then back again with almost maternal care, "how a convenience begs to be a conspiracy if you leave it half persuaded. The thing will do mischief of its own accord unless one keeps a hand upon it. That is as true of men as of brass fittings. You cannot keep a hand upon all London," I protested. He smiled. "No, but I can teach one or two more constables to read a candle's head. Lestrade is already insufferable on the subject. His wife refuses to dine by gas. Then you have altered domestic life for the better," said I. "For once," he conceded. It was in that same hour that he drew from the drawer of his desk a few objects I had almost forgotten. A penknife with its trace of softened gutter, a tiny paper with a ladder of bagats and the faint graphite of a thief's mind, and the square of brass that had travelled from Hampstead to the court and back again. "Keep them in your case-book," he said, handing me the paper. "The public likes a symbol, and this will do. Say that a gentleman was brought to justice by a candle and a square. They will call it fanciful and remember it all the longer. You will be accused of romancing," I warned him. "Then we will leave the romancing to you, my dear fellow," he returned, with that affectionate mockery which is the coin of our friendship. "Only do not neglect the modest. When the tale is told, give a line to a butler's hand that knew how to lift weight, another to a surgeon's nose that smelt what constables forget, and a paragraph, if you must be generous, to a certain inspector who, by some miracle of grace, did not clap the wrong man in irons too soon." He took up his violin then and let his bow travel once, softly, across the strings. The tone was pure and even, as if the instrument itself had been put to rights by the same inflexible ear that had set our case in tune. Presently he played a little air I did not recognize, grave, measured, and with a cadence that hovered between regret and rightness. "What is that?" I asked. "A psalm," he said, with the faintest smile. "I do not play them often, but for the book upon our table, and for a servant who tore out a sin with his hands when he had no other tool, it is in key. There is little more to add. The Bible Jarvis brought us stands yet upon our shelf, its leaves uncut, save where duty and curiosity meet. Sometimes, when a client departs and the smoke of Holmes's cigarette hangs in a pale skein across the window, my friend will lay his finger upon that sober binding as if taking a pulse. If it quickens his mind to future labour, I am content. If it quiets an impatience which only a knotty problem can appease, I am more content still. For it seems to me that the case taught us what few adventures do, that not all cleverness belongs to scoundrels, and not all blunders to fools, that a house breathes through the little things, and that in the balance between a wick and a tap, a man may find either ruin or reprieve. "Write it as you like," Holmes said to me, on the night I closed my notes. "But if the world will have a moral, give it this: let a man keep his squares straight, and his leaves in their places, and he may sleep by his own fire. If he will not, the air turns against him, and even a candle will bear witness I have obeyed him as best I can. And if, as I post these pages, I catch myself glancing, by habit, at the little brass tap on our own wall, I am not ashamed. The eye which Holmes has trained in me can no more forget a danger once seen than it can unlearn the shape of his back bent over a clue. It is a small tribute to a great reasoner, and an honest homage to the truth that in this affair of the Bible with pages torn away, proved itself not in thunderous declarations, but in the softest of whispers, the breath of a room that could not breathe, the hush upon a wick, and the quiet, inexorable conscience of a man who, having stood once, at last sat down to take what was his due.